You know the drill, smash that like button until it gives up, and hit subscribe because trust me, we're just getting warmed up here. Things are about to get intense. Our tale kicks off in the middle of devastation. Rose Palace, the proud fortress of the Ragnar clan, is engulfed in chaos and flames. Its people, servants, knights, and guards are being butchered like animals, one after another, by assailants who seem to appear out of nowhere. Amidst the slaughter stands Theo Ragnar, our protagonist, fighting desperately to fend off one of the attackers. He swings his sword upward, forcing the man back, but there's no time to celebrate. His opponent recovers, raising his blade high before bringing it down in a brutal arc Theo barely manages to block, his arms shaking from the impact. The Ragnar family is no ordinary noble house. For over 1,000 years, they've served as the Empire's great northern wall, a bulwark against any threat that dared approach. Their strength, whispered to be a legacy of dragons, runs deep in the bloodline. Every member is born with an almost unnatural power, magic that could topple mountains, stamina that would shame a warhorse, and sword skills that could carve a path through any enemy. That is, every member except Theo. Somehow, despite his blood, he was born with none of it. The black sheep in a family of prodigies. As if to hammer the point home, Theo takes a devastating blow to the stomach. The pain hits like a tidal wave, and he collapses to his knees. His attacker looks down at him with a sneer, his voice dripping with disdain. "Still don't get it, do you?" he taunts. "No matter how much you struggle, some things will always be beyond your reach." He spits the word out like a curse. "Talent." Slowly, the man removes his mask, revealing his face. It's Rendon, Theo's sword instructor. The shock stabs deeper than any blade. Theo's voice trembles with betrayal and fury as he demands answers, but Rendon only chuckles, a low, mocking sound. "It was pitiful, you know," he says, "watching you train every morning, like it would actually make a difference. You, the joke of the Ragnar family." He scoffs. "You should have just stayed hidden away, where you belonged." Anger flares in Theo's chest, giving him the strength to stand. "Did you become my instructor just to betray us?" he growls. "Just to sell out Rose Palace?" But before he can react, Rendon's sword flashes out, slicing into Theo's arm. Blood sprays across the ground as Theo screams, pain crashing over him like a wave. Rendon grabs Theo's hair and yanks his head up, forcing their eyes to meet. "Why are you blaming me?" he asks, his tone almost bored. "Look around. The palace is burning, your family is dying. And it's all because of you." His voice drops to a taunting whisper. "Why can't you see it?" As Theo's vision blurs from the pain, another figure steps forward, dragging a limp body behind him. He tosses the woman at Theo's feet like a discarded rag doll. Rendon's grin is cruel as he gestures to her lifeless form. "Your mother," he says, his voice soft with mock pity. Nothing but a cold, dead corpse now. The sight of his mother lying there, lifeless and broken, hits Theo harder than any blow. His breath catches in his throat, and a raw, desperate rage surges up from deep inside. "Rendon," he whispers, trembling as he reaches for the sword at his side. With a roar, he swings wildly, driven by nothing but blind fury. But before his strike can connect, a blade hurtles through the air and pierces his chest. The force of the impact knocks him flat on his back, and the world begins to fade. Blood pools beneath him as he struggles to breathe, and Rendon's companion sighs with exasperation. "Enough talking. Just finish him." Rendon lets out a weary chuckle. Fine. I was just reminiscing." As Theo's life slips away, a crushing sense of regret settles in. This can't be how it ends. He couldn't protect his family, couldn't prove himself, couldn't change a damn thing. As the flames consume everything he's ever known, a bitter thought echoes in his mind. Maybe if he'd had even a shred of talent, things could have been different. His tears mingle with the blood on his face as he closes his eyes, darkness swallowing him whole. But then, as if reality itself has decided to play a cruel trick, a system message appears out of thin air. "You have died. Your trait has activated." Returning to the regression point, Theo's eyes snap open, and he finds himself back in the training yard, staring at a very much alive Rendon, who's casually suggesting they wrap up for the day. Theo blinks in confusion, the memories of his death still vivid. Did he really die? Or was it all some kind of sick dream? Rendon, noticing Theo's faraway look, raises an eyebrow. What's gotten into you? You're completely out of it. Theo, still reeling, wonders if what he experienced was real. Could that have been the afterlife? If it was, then death certainly had a twisted sense of humor. Before he can even begin to make sense of it all, another system message pops up in front of him. Tutorial quest number 1. Punch Rendon in the face. Theo stares at the prompt, utterly bewildered. What kind of absurd task is this? He glances back and forth between Rendon, who's looking increasingly impatient, and the message floating in front of him. Rendon doesn't seem to see it, so whatever this is, it's happening just to Theo. What's wrong with you? Rendon snaps, but Theo's attention is elsewhere. His wooden sword drops from his hand, and he takes a step forward, his fist trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. Whatever's going on, whether it's divine intervention or a hallucination, Theo figures he might as well take advantage of it. If this is a dream, then why not give Rendon a good punch? Theo swings his fist with all the force he can muster, and it lands squarely on Rendon's jaw. The entire yard goes silent. But to Theo's surprise, the punch barely seems to faze Rendon at all. Why does this feel so real if it's just a dream? Before he can ponder it further, Rendon's wooden sword cracks against his shoulder, knocking him to the ground. Theo gasps in pain, his confusion only deepening. Can you feel pain in a dream? Rendon shakes his head. You've lost it, he says, his tone a mixture of disappointment and irritation. With the awakening ceremony so close, you're cracking under the pressure. He scoffs and turns to walk away. Next time, try using a sword. That's what a Ragnar is supposed to do. Theo lies in the dirt, stunned, as the knights nearby start to snicker. Did you see that? What an idiot. One of them jeers. Is he really a Ragnar? Even an illegitimate child would have more talent. Theo touches his cheek, still stinging from the slap of reality. The sensations are all too real. This isn't some flashback, it's actually happening. He remembers that the awakening ceremony was supposed to happen 10 years ago. Could it be that he's somehow been thrown back to his 17-year-old self? Just then, the system appears again. Congratulations on completing tutorial quest number 1. Ragnar's talent has been activated. Theo stares at the message, his mind racing. His talent awakened? The system asks if he wants to claim his reward. With nothing to lose, he raises a trembling hand and selects yes. Instantly, a surge of light radiates from his body, and his stats skyrocket as if he's suddenly turned into some kind of overpowered hero. He barely has time to process it all as he stammers. What in the world is going on? Later, back in the guest room of Rose Palace, Rendon reports to Lady Cecilia Ragnar, Theo's mother. Honestly, I've never seen anyone with so little talent, he says, though his voice carries a hint of amusement. But that's precisely why I'm here, to whip him into shape before the awakening ceremony. She nods, pressing a small bag of gold coins into his hand, asking him to give Theo some extra attention. Rendon smirks. Don't worry, I'll work him day and night, he says, exuding false confidence. But as he turns away, his expression darkens, and he mutters under his breath, she's going to need to worry. In his mind, neither Cecilia nor Theo is destined for greatness. Their bloodline, as far as Rendon is concerned, is as useless as Theo's sword skills. Still, he doesn't mind. The gold is real and he's getting paid after all. Rendon's smirk stretched across his face. His salary was fat, his title of swordsmanship tutor to the Ragnar family's direct line was secure, and thanks to some secret deals, his future was looking brighter than Theo's prospects ever had. Sabotaging Theo's progress while feeding info to some mysterious backer had become his ticket to success, and Theo, the so-called imbecile of Ragnar, was none the wiser. But just as he was savoring his private victory, a blur shot past him, nearly knocking him off balance. It was Theo, sprinting at full tilt toward the guest room without even a glance in Rendon's direction. Rendon's eyes narrowed as his sneer deepened. "Idiot!" he muttered under his breath. "Can't even greet his own instructor." Theo burst into the guest room, breathless, and called out to his mother. Lady Cecilia Ragnar, sitting gracefully at a small writing desk, looked up, surprised but smiling sweetly. "Theo, you're back. You must be exhausted from all that training." But instead of answering, Theo threw his arms around her, hugging her tightly. Her expression shifted to one of confusion as she stammered, "What's gotten into you?" Tears welled up in Theo's eyes, and he couldn't help but smile as he tightened his embrace. It was real. He really had returned to 10 years ago, before everything had fallen apart. The vivid memory of Rendon forcing him to stare at her lifeless body in that burning ruin came crashing back. But here she was now, alive and warm in his arms. The relief and joy were almost too much to bear. Cecilia gently pulled back to look at her son, her eyes filled with concern. "Theo, what's wrong?" she asked softly. But Theo wasn't about to explain the whole died and got sent back in time situation. Instead, he made a silent vow right then and there. He would change the future no matter what. Weak and talentless as he was now, he'd find a way to grow stronger. If that mysterious system was real, it could be the key to breaking the chains of his fate. He would become powerful enough to protect his mother, and when the time came, Rendon would pay dearly. As if on cue, a system message flickered into view. Tutorial quest number 2. Train your body to the limit. Theo didn't waste a second. He practically flew out of the guest room and headed straight for the training grounds, his legs pounding against the earth as he started running laps. Every step echoed with the single, burning focus that now fueled him: revenge. But he quickly realized that, in his current state, revenge wasn't something he could seize anytime soon. First, he needed strength, real strength. As he pushed his body harder, Theo's mind wandered back to a clandestine organization he'd become involved with in his previous life: Black Word. Even though his lack of skill had confined him to the information team, some of the secrets he'd uncovered back then might now prove invaluable. He recalled one in particular: a potent elixir called the Bloody Sword Emperor's Elixir, its true worth revealed only through an obscure manual in the future. If he could get his hands on it and combine it with a grueling training regimen, it could be the breakthrough he desperately needed. Hours passed as Theo continued his relentless circuit around the training grounds, not pausing even once as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. He was drenched in sweat, his muscles screaming, but the system kept feeding him updates. Progress: 27%. His determination only grew. A knight nearby, noticing Theo's unyielding pace, called out in disbelief. "How many laps have you run, young master? You look like you've been training for days." Theo ignored him, his focus unbroken. He picked up a wooden sword and began swinging it furiously between sprints, pushing himself further with each repetition. As the days bled into one another, Theo barely allowed himself time to breathe, let alone sleep. Evelyn Naravel, manager of training ground number 4, watched him from her perch, her brows knitting together as she took a long drag from her cigar. "So, this is the so-called imbecile of Ragnar?" she murmured to herself. Despite what everyone said about Theo being talentless, there was no denying the kid's dedication. She found herself questioning if maybe, just maybe, the rumors were wrong. Theo's limbs felt like lead, and every breath came with a sharp sting, but the system kept dangling that number in front of him: 97% completion. He gritted his teeth and pushed on, recalling how, just the night before, he had taken a brief rest upon reaching 90%. When he checked the system again, his progress had dropped. The cruel reality dawned on him. The system punished him for resting. It wanted him to go all out or not at all. Now, as he reached 98%, Theo forced himself to run harder, pushing his wooden sword through the air with all the speed he could muster. The final percentage point loomed like a mountain, and he wasn't about to let exhaustion steal this victory from him. Evelyn watched with wide eyes, her cigar forgotten in her hand. as Theo kept leaping and swinging, as though pain was just another enemy to be cut down. Finally, when the system flashed 100% completion, Theo's legs gave out beneath him. He crashed to the ground, barely able to move, his vision a blur of light and shadow. The system chimed in with a congratulatory message. Tutorial quest number 2 completed. Rewards unlocked. But the words swam before his eyes, and he couldn't make sense of them. With a trembling hand, he reached out and managed to click yes to claim his rewards. As soon as he did, his consciousness slipped away, and a bright light surged into his body, filling him with a strange, invigorating power. A powerful gust of air swept through the training ground, making Evelyn gasp. When Theo awoke, he bolted upright, instantly alert. He wasn't outside anymore, but lying on a cot in a small room. Evelyn strolled in casually, the cigar still hanging from her lips. "Calm down, young master," she said. "You're in the break room." Collapsing like that after days of non-stop training, even a Ragnar would need a break. Theo recognized her instantly, which seemed to amuse her. She introduced herself with a knowing smile, then handed him a glass of water. "Drink up. You've earned it." Theo gulped down the water gratefully. As he did, Evelyn's expression grew more serious. "Tell me," she said, her voice low, "you know the rules about opening your mana hall before the awakening ceremony, don't you?" Theo blinked in surprise. "Yes," he replied slowly, trying to gauge where she was going with this. "And you know what happens to those who break that rule, don't you?" She pressed, her gaze never leaving his. "Why are you bringing this up?" Theo asked, his pulse quickening. "Because," Evelyn said, her tone dropping to a near growl, "just before you collapsed, there was a mana wave, one that aligns with the opening of a mana hall." She leaned in closer. "Did you open yours, young Master Theo?" Theo's thoughts spun. If his mana hall had indeed been opened, he shouldn't have survived. Yet he felt different, stronger. He remembered the system notification. Reward, Dragon Heart, came back to him in a rush. As a bonus for his fast completion, the system had granted him magic power equivalent to 10 years of training. He now possessed a Dragon Heart, a power so rare that even the most seasoned warriors could only dream of. A Dragon Heart. Mana halls were typically placed in the lower abdomen to avoid overburdening the human heart. But the heart of a dragon could house a mana hall directly, amplifying its power tenfold. It was a shortcut to overwhelming strength that no ordinary human could survive, until now. Theo's gaze shifted to Evelyn, realizing that she wasn't just some manager. She had once commanded the white armored dragon cavalry, renowned for her principles and fearless leadership. Even the demon dragon who served in the cavalry had admired her. She was known for her integrity, despising dishonesty and cowardice. In his past life, Theo recalled how her strict adherence to honor had led her to resign as his mentor when he showed a lack of resolve. Now, standing before her with a power that could either be his salvation or doom, he had to tread carefully. If Evelyn found out about the Dragon Heart, she wouldn't just let it slide. The truth about his Dragon Heart and the mana hall within it was a secret Theo would guard with his life. If Evelyn discovered it, she wouldn't hesitate to report him for execution. Her principles were ironclad, no exceptions, no mercy. But Theo, a grin playing on his lips, considered his options. Could he outmaneuver her without tipping his hand? Theo's voice was calm but carried a weight of authority as he addressed Evelyn. "You know the consequences of accusing an heir of Ragnar without solid proof, right?" he asked, locking eyes with her. "Your suspicions alone could get me killed. But if you're wrong, well, that's a stain on the Ragnar name." Evelyn hesitated, her stern expression faltering as she absorbed his words. She knew all too well that if her accusations were unfounded, it would bring disgrace upon her, not him. Theo pressed on. "So, tell me then, what's the penalty for falsely accusing a member of the Ragnar family of breaking such a grave rule?" Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she answered, "Execution." There it was, the harsh truth, hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. Theo nodded approvingly, acknowledging her knowledge of the law, and added with a provocative smirk, Well, then, go ahead and check me if you dare. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. She had felt a mana wave. She was sure of it. Anger flared in her chest as she released a surge of her own power, preparing to inspect Theo's abdomen for the telltale signs of an opened mana hall. But as she looked, nothing appeared. No mana hall, no evidence of any forbidden act. Her brow furrowed in disbelief. Had she been mistaken? Theo tilted his head with feigned curiosity. Nothing there. Huh? He asked, his tone light as if they were discussing the weather. Evelyn's face flushed with a mix of confusion and shame. She immediately dropped to one knee, bowing her head. "Forgive me, young master," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. "I was wrong. I've committed a grave sin and I offer my life as atonement." But Theo wasn't interested in spilling blood. He understood the stakes and knew Evelyn had done what she believed was right. His smirk softened into a reassuring smile as he reached out and tapped her shoulder. "There's no need for all that," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "You acted out of duty, and there aren't many people brave enough to demand the truth from a Ragnar, knowing the risk." As Theo turned to walk away, he threw one last remark over his shoulder. "By the way, you were worried about my mana hall overflowing? That's quite the imagination you've got there. I'm just the bastard of Ragnar. Remember?" He chuckled. "Thanks for your concern, though." Evelyn watched him go, stunned and silent, the cigar still dangling from her lips, forgotten. As Theo left the training grounds break room, his thoughts lingered on his newly acquired dragon heart and the magic power the system had gifted him. 10 years' worth of accumulated strength, a potent force that made his future seem brighter than ever before. He would harness this power, sharpen it like a blade, and make sure the world would never see him as a helpless fool again. A few days later, the training ground echoed with the bark of Rendon's commands. "Your sword swing is all wrong, Theo," he shouted, growing visibly frustrated. "You need to adjust your stance more to the right." "How many times do I have to tell you?" Theo nodded, playing the part of an obedient student, though inside he was fuming. Pretending to be weak while enduring Rendon's lessons was getting more exhausting by the day. As Rendon stepped in to adjust Theo's grip, something clicked. Theo could see the subtle way Rendon was teaching him flawed techniques, deliberately setting him up for failure. There was no doubt in Theo's mind now. Someone else was pulling the strings behind Rendon's actions. He needed to find out who was orchestrating this grand betrayal. An idea sparked in Theo's mind, and he turned to Rendon, a sly grin creeping across his face. "Instructor, may I have a word?" he called out. Rendon's head snapped up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "We don't chat during lessons, young master," he snapped. But before he could continue, Theo calmly broke the wooden sword in his hands with a swift motion, tossing the pieces aside. "Then I'll make it quick," Theo said, his voice cold. "This training is nonsense. If you're such a great swordsman, how did you manage to become a mid-rank instructor with skills like these? You'd struggle against a low-rank demonic beast, let alone someone like me." The insult landed like a punch to the gut, and Rendon's face went white with fury. "Say that again," Rendon growled, barely keeping his composure. "I said your skills are garbage," Theo repeated, each word hitting like a hammer. He wasn't just looking to humiliate Rendon. He was setting the stage for something bigger. If he could provoke Rendon enough, maybe he'd be forced to reveal his connection to the hidden puppet master. Rendon's temper snapped. "Young master or not, you will not speak to me like that," he shouted, but Theo's calm demeanor remained unshaken. If Rendon was going to push things, then Theo would push back even harder. As he mulled over his options, it became clear. If he could force Rendon to resign, the chances of uncovering the true mastermind would increase dramatically. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire. At Camellia Palace, a knight rushed into the dining hall, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Have you heard? The bastard of Ragnar is set to duel his instructor next week." Across the room, Action Ragnar, one of the four hounds of the north known as the Dark Tiger, scoffed and hurled his glass at the knight. The glass shattered, and the knight collapsed, bleeding. What does it matter if that so-called bastard gets himself half-killed? Action sneered, wiping his mouth. Next to him, Remington Narcio, the Silver Lion, remained silent, his expression unreadable. Another figure stepped into the room, his presence commanding attention. It was Ed Troyven, the Nine-Dragon Sky Dragon, his gaze piercing. "You should care, Action," Ed cautioned. "Even a small flame can start a wildfire if you're not careful." Action's eyes narrowed, and he snorted. "Only those with real talent are worth worrying about. Why should I be concerned with Theo?" Ed's voice dropped to a low rumble. "Because when it comes to the Ragnar clan, even the smallest possibility can't be ignored." Remington bowed respectfully to Ed, but Action dismissed his uncle's warning with a wave of his hand. "Rendon will handle it. No need to fret over a duel with a bastard." A week later, training ground number 4 was buzzing with anticipation. Knights gathered around the stage as Theo and Rendon stepped forward. In the crowd, Evelyn stood alongside another prominent figure, their eyes fixed on the two combatants. Theo gripped his sword tightly, cursing himself for letting the situation escalate this far. What had started as a plan to embarrass Rendon and get him dismissed had spiraled out of control. But now that he was here, with the eyes of the crowd upon him, he had to make this fight count. The cheers of the audience faded as the system displayed his third tutorial quest: fight Rendon and win. He recalled the incident a week earlier, when he had snapped the wooden sword and dismissed Rendon on the spot, telling him to get lost. Furious, Rendon had protested, claiming his contract still had time left. But Theo had brushed him off. "If I say you're fired, he had declared with finality. Theo wasn't foolish enough to think he could kill Rendon with his current skills. But forcing a separation would give him time to investigate and gather more information. Rendon, however, wasn't about to let things go that easily. If he was dismissed, his mission would fail, and whoever had sent him wouldn't take that lightly. Rendon had practically chased Theo down, begging him to reconsider and threatening to report the firing to the tribunal, warning of the potential consequences. Just as the tension reached a boiling point, Evelyn had appeared and suggested a different solution. "Resolve it the Ragnar way," she said, her voice carrying a challenge. Theo stared at Evelyn, unsure if she was serious. "Settle it by a sword match?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, the rule of the strong. No need for the tribunal, just a straightforward duel. The victor decides." Rendon's face lit up at the idea, his confidence swelling. It was as if the gods themselves had handed him the perfect opportunity. Evelyn continued, setting the date. "1 week from now," she declared, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. "Does that seem fair?" Theo's heart sank, his mouth too dry to respond. Fair wasn't exactly the word he'd use. He glanced at Rendon, who was all too aware of Theo's current limitations, and grinned with smug satisfaction, practically daring Theo to back out. Meanwhile, 2 knights nearby whispered among themselves. "I heard the kid can barely swing a sword," scoffed the black-haired knight. "Isn't he still a Ragnar?" the brown-haired knight asked incredulously. "Not a normal Ragnar," the other snickered. "They call him the Ragnar Cripple for a reason. No way he's taking down a mid-rank swordsman like Rendon." On the stage, Rendon offered Theo an out. "If you apologize now, I'll forget this ever happened," he said with false kindness. "There's no need to throw your life away over pride." But Theo's eyes sharpened as he shot back. "Funny. I was about to say the same. If you don't want to lose an arm, you'd better accept that you're fired." Rendon's expression darkened. The audacity! He had considered sparing Theo out of pity, but now he was going to kill him and pretend it was an accident. The outcome was obvious to him. This duel was as good as won. With a mocking flourish, he invited Theo to make the first move. "As your instructor, I'll graciously allow you the opening strike." Theo didn't need another invitation. He charged forward, shouting that he wouldn't hold back. Their swords met with a clash that echoed across the training ground. Within moments, Rendon's superior skill shone through as he unleashed a flurry of strikes, driving Theo back step by step. The audience murmured with disappointment. It was just as they'd expected. "Look at him," someone jeered. "The idiot can barely keep his footing." They laughed, speculating that if Theo didn't surrender soon, he'd be a corpse by the end of the match. Rendon's attacks came with increasing intensity as he sneered. "What happened? Theo? You're the one who looked down on mid-rank swordsmen, and now you can barely keep up." In Rendon's mind, Theo was still just an apprentice. Even if Theo's skills had seen some improvement lately, they were nowhere near good enough to win against him. If Theo had been at the level of the Four Hounds of the North, it might have been different, but Rendon was certain there was no chance the so-called imbecile could best him. But despite the onslaught, Theo remained composed, his mind flashing back to the conversation he'd had with Evelyn earlier. He had sought her out to understand why she'd suggested the duel. "Why go that far?" he had asked. Evelyn had explained, "If you want to get rid of Rendon for good, you need to be thorough. He likely has a backer. Simply firing him won't be enough." Theo had been taken aback by her insight. "How do you know?" Evelyn revealed that she had grown suspicious of Rendon's bizarre teaching style weeks ago. One day, while observing the training ground, she'd noticed Rendon instructing Theo to angle his sword in an absurdly exaggerated way. It was the kind of advice that screamed of intentional sabotage. She'd then dug into Rendon's background and found traces linking him to Camellia Palace. That was when she realized this was more than just bad teaching, it was part of a larger scheme. Back in the present, Rendon's smirk faded as he noticed Theo pushing back harder than expected. "What is this?" he muttered. There was a confidence in Theo's movements that hadn't been there before, and it was unsettling. Theo's eyes gleamed with determination as he parried another strike, then pushed Rendon's blade aside with surprising ease. "Come on, Rendon," Theo taunted. "Is that all a mid-rank swordsman can do?" Rendon's anger flared. This wasn't right. Theo shouldn't have lasted this long. His strikes grew more desperate as he tried to overpower Theo, but each time, Theo's defenses held firm. The crowd's jeers turned to gasps of shock as they watched the Ragnar cripple, pushing back a seasoned swordsman. Amidst the audience, Remington observed the duel with a curious gaze, while Evelyn watched with a knowing smile. She recalled telling Theo that if she trained him personally for even a week, he'd easily handle someone like Rendon. "He's a disgrace of an instructor," she had said bluntly, "and he deserves to be put in his place." Theo had taken her words to heart, and now it was paying off, but something still nagged at him. In their earlier conversation, Theo had asked Evelyn why she was so invested in his success. "Is it because of what happened before?" he had inquired. Evelyn had admitted that was part of it, but then added cryptically, "There's someone I know who's obsessed with collecting talent. If they catch wind of your progress, they'll take an interest in you." Back on the battlefield, Rendon stepped back, raising his sword for a powerful strike. But when he brought it down, Theo blocked the blow effortlessly, sending a shockwave of doubt through Rendon. How was this possible? Theo, who had shown no talent his entire life, was suddenly fighting like an entirely different person. Rendon's thoughts raced as he wondered if Theo had been feigning weakness all along. With a sudden burst of speed, Theo closed the distance, his eyes cold as steel. "Tell me," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "who's been pulling your strings, Rendon?" The question sent a jolt through Rendon, and he lashed out in rage, swinging his sword in a wide arc. "How dare you accuse me of—" Theo parried the blow, his expression calm. "Your teachings were substandard, designed to hold me back. But I found out about Camellia Palace." Rendon froze, his face paling. How could Theo have discovered that? Seeing the shock in Rendon's eyes, Theo grinned. He had hit the mark. With a sudden, fluid motion, Theo lunged forward. "Let's see how you like losing an arm," he whispered. Before Rendon could react, Theo's blade sliced clean through, severing Rendon's arm in one decisive strike. The audience gasped, and even Remington leaned forward, his eyes widening as Rendon's severed limb hit the ground. Rendon collapsed, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his screams tearing through the air. You'll pay for this." He spat through the pain, but Theo's confidence was only growing stronger. He approached slowly, savoring the moment. The tables had turned, and the man who had once mocked him for being weak was now at his mercy. As Theo stood over Rendon, he reflected on how far he'd come. The boy who had once been called the imbecile of Ragnar was gone, replaced by someone ready to carve out his own path, one severed arm at a time. Theo stared down at Rendon, his face cold and unyielding. "Remember what you said to me before?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You told me it was my fault, that everything fell apart because I was weak." His expression darkened, his grip tightening on his sword. "Well, Rendon, it's your fault you're dying here today." Rendon's eyes widened, terror setting in as he fumbled to speak, his voice cracking. "Wait, please, But Theo's resolve was ironclad. Without a hint of hesitation, he swung his sword, and in a swift motion, Rendon's head separated from his body, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. The system chimed in immediately, congratulating Theo on completing his third tutorial quest. The crowd remained frozen, shock evident on every face. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, a glint of pride in her eyes. Amidst the sea of stunned spectators, a mysterious figure observed the scene, a satisfied smile curling at the corner of his lips. As the silence hung thick in the air, the system informed Theo that he had exceeded the quest's objective, granting him a bonus reward. Blood still on his face, Theo accepted it without a second thought. The murmurs in the audience grew louder. "Did that really just happen?" a knight whispered. "The so-called imbecile actually won?" Another shook his head in disbelief. "He's just an apprentice swordsman. How did he defeat a mid-tier like Rendon?" Theo barely acknowledged the crowd's incredulity. He glanced down at Rendon's lifeless form, a wave of realization washing over him. In his past life, he had suffered at the hands of this weak, deceitful man. How could he have ever let Rendon hold power over him? The system pinged again, this time notifying him that his new ability, observation, had been activated as part of his reward, along with an additional year's worth of magic power. Theo marveled at the idea of a full year's power instantly granted to him, but couldn't help wondering what exactly observation could do. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a massive crash, the ground shaking beneath him. Theo looked up to see a figure descending from the sky, landing on the stage with enough force to crack the stone floor beneath their feet. His breath caught in his throat as the dust settled, revealing the unmistakable form of Julius Ragnar, the demon dragon and commander of the white armored dragon cavalry. A jolt of panic surged through Theo. Julius was no ordinary man. He was one of the 9 dragons, a legend in his own right. The crowd erupted in a mixture of awe and terror, the knights calling out, "It's Julius Ragnar!" and "The demon dragon is here!" Evelyn, standing at the edge of the training ground, exhaled a long sigh. "Does he always have to make an entrance like that?" she muttered. "Couldn't he have used the stairs for once?" As Julius strode toward Theo, his intense gaze seemed to pierce right through him. Theo's panic grew as the commander stopped only a few feet away, his eyes narrowing dangerously. But then, to Theo's utter shock, Julius threw his head back and let out a booming laugh, the sound reverberating across the training ground. He clapped a hand on Theo's back, nearly knocking him over. "That was quite the spectacle, young man," Julius exclaimed, his voice full of warmth. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that." Theo blinked, struggling to process the sudden change in mood. Julius's fierce glare had been replaced by a look of genuine amusement. Did the student really surpass the master? Julius continued, a playful grin spreading across his face. Maybe that's a bit too generous, considering you killed him." He shrugged as if the act of beheading one's instructor was a minor inconvenience. "Well, Rendon probably had it coming." Before Theo could respond, Julius tightened his grip on his shoulder, his enthusiasm palpable. "How would you like to join the white armored dragon cavalry?" he asked. The offer hung in the air like a thunderclap, leaving Theo momentarily speechless. He glanced at Evelyn, who was watching with a knowing smile, as if she had anticipated this exact outcome. The knights whispered furiously amongst themselves, struggling to understand what they were witnessing. Is he really being scouted into the white armored cavalry? One knight murmured, but he hasn't even gone through the awakening ceremony. Remington, who had been observing from a distance, turned to a fellow knight. Has there ever been a case where an apprentice swordsman was recruited, especially one without an opened mana hall? The knight shook his head, his expression serious. No, not that I've heard of. It's unprecedented. A closed mana hall makes it impossible to gauge true potential. Despite the voices buzzing around him, Theo kept his focus on Julius. After a deep breath, he spoke with a tone of unwavering conviction. I appreciate the offer, Commander, but I have to decline. The training ground fell deathly silent. Julius's smile faded as he stared at Theo, clearly taken aback. Remington and Evelyn exchanged confused glances, while the other knights were left speechless. Why would anyone turn down such an opportunity? As whispers filled the air, Theo's voice rose above the noise. I'm not ready yet, he said, his eyes meeting Julius's. There's more I need to accomplish on my own. Julius studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable, before breaking into another laugh. You're an interesting one, Theo Ragnar, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Very well. If you're not ready now, I suppose we'll see if you change your mind in the future. In the days that followed, the story of Theo's duel spread like wildfire. Whispers about the imbecile of Ragnar, who had somehow killed his own master, rippled through the empire. Some scoffed, saying Rendon must have been a weakling for such an outcome to occur. Yet what truly captivated everyone was that Julius Ragnar, the demon dragon himself, had attempted to recruit Theo into the white armored dragon cavalry, only for Theo to turn him down. At Camellia Palace, Lady Amel Ragnar, the mistress of the estate and mother to Action, slammed a fist down on the table. I can't believe Theo actually killed Rendon, she spat, her voice full of frustration. Her brother, Ed, sat across from her, his demeanor calm as always. Rendon was assigned to Theo because of his lackluster skills, Ed reminded her. It's no great loss. Emel's brow furrowed. That's not the point, she retorted. The real issue is that Julius reached out to Theo personally, and it appears Evelyn was the one who arranged the duel. She rubbed her temples, feeling the situation slipping out of control. We can't interfere anymore. Not with Julius and Evelyn showing interest in him. Amel's thoughts were interrupted as the door opened and Action Ragnar sauntered into the room. Mother, what do you mean by standing out? He asked, his tone laced with arrogance. Theo's still a nobody. Why worry? Amel shot him a sharp look. Because if Theo becomes too prominent, it'll be harder for us to seize control of Rose Palace. Action waved dismissively. Theo's still powerless. Evelyn and Julius are always drawn to the underdogs. It doesn't change anything. Ed's gaze turned stern. Don't underestimate him, Action. This could be more than just a fluke. Ignoring his uncle's caution, Action leaned against the table, a smirk curling his lips. Since you're both so concerned, maybe I'll pay Theo a little visit and remind him where he belongs. The next day, after a rigorous training session, Evelyn praised Theo for his progress. You've improved significantly, she said, her expression showing a hint of pride. Theo nodded, grateful for her guidance. It's made a world of difference to learn from a real master, he admitted. But joining the cavalry now, it would have limited my options. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. And what options would those be? Theo glanced toward the distant horizon, his thoughts on the future. The top performer of the awakening ceremony receives privileges that surpass even the prestige of the cavalry, he explained. I want to earn my place without relying on special treatment. Evelyn studied him thoughtfully, then smiled. Commander Julius may be disappointed, but I think I understand your choice. Curious, Theo activated his new observation ability. A screen appeared, revealing that Evelyn was 24 years old, a high-ranked swordsman, and former deputy commander of the White Armored Dragon Cavalry. Her current status showed she admired his humility, enjoyed teaching him, and missed her time with the cavalry. The insight made Theo smile. The ability was proving to be more useful than he'd anticipated. But before he could say more, a young man approached, his steps brisk and his posture respectful. "Excuse me, young master," he said, introducing himself. "My name is Sybil Dree from the Southern Inspection Post. There's something urgent we need to discuss." As Theo eyed Sybil cautiously, he couldn't help but notice the young man's intense expression. Intrigued, he activated his observation skill once more. The system revealed a surprising profile. Sybil Dree, age 17, the dunce of the Southern Inspection Post, and an apprentice swordsman. His rank was loyalty, and his status indicated a strong admiration for Theo, along with an earnest desire to spar with him. Theo blinked, taken aback. The stern-faced Sybil actually wanted to challenge him to a match? At that moment, the system chimed in with a new notification. Final tutorial quest. Discard the title Imbecile of Ragnar. Completion goal 100%. It showed that Theo was already at 28%. As he processed the information, Sybil spoke up, admitting that he had once looked down on Theo, believing the title Ragnar's Imbecile had suited him. A surge of anger flared in Theo, and he instinctively gripped his sword. But before Theo could act on his irritation, Sybil continued, his tone sincere. "I've seen you train every morning," he confessed. "You worked harder than anyone, and the result was a miracle. You defeated Rendon, earned the attention of the demon dragon himself. You became someone worth admiring." Sybil's eyes were filled with determination. "I almost gave up after being mocked as the idiot of the Southern Inspection Post, but watching you gave me hope." Sybil then bowed deeply, raising his sword above his head in a gesture of respect. "Please, young master, grant me the honor of crossing swords with you," he implored. Normally, Theo would have been suspicious of such a request, but the observation skill confirmed Sybil's sincerity. It was unexpected, but Theo realized that taking down Rendon and attracting the attention of Julius Ragnar had made him a target for those seeking to prove themselves. What surprised Theo even more was that some, like Sybil, wanted to follow him instead. Perhaps, despite everything, the pride of the Ragnar name still carried weight. Theo knew he would eventually need loyal followers if he were to rise to the head of the Ragnar clan. His final quest, to discard the title of Imbecile of Ragnar, was not just about gaining strength. It was about gaining respect and loyalty. Turning to Evelyn, Theo asked if they could have a moment. She gave him an encouraging nod, a proud smile forming on her lips. "Show him what you've got, Theo," she said. Theo raised his sword, formally introducing himself. "Theo Ragnar, apprentice swordsman of Rose Palace, awaiting the awakening ceremony. Evelyn Naravel is my master." Evelyn's smile grew at the mention of her name, a glint of pride in her eyes. Sybil mirrored the introduction. Sybil Dree, apprentice swordsman of the Southern Inspection Post, practitioner of the Kure clan's quick sword style. With the formalities complete, Theo gave a nod. "Let's have a good spar." Without hesitation, Sybil dashed forward, his sword flashing in a blur. But Theo was prepared, blocking the initial strike with ease. Sybil's eyes widened. "You're fast!" he exclaimed, his tone a mix of surprise and excitement. For someone labeled as the Southern Inspection Post's idiot, Sybil's speed was nothing to scoff at. Sybil pressed the attack, launching a flurry of strikes at Theo, who met each blow with practiced precision. As the clash continued, Theo's thoughts drifted back to his past life, where he would have struggled against even a novice. But now, with a surge of strength, he raised his sword and sent Sybil flying backward, easily overpowering him. Sybil hit the ground hard, letting out a grunt of pain, but his expression was anything but disappointed. A grin spread across his face as he struggled to stand. "You're incredible, young master," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "I'm honored to have lost to you." Theo lowered his sword, signaling the end of the duel. "Well fought, Sybil. You did well." As Theo sheathed his weapon, he caught his reflection in the gleaming blade. A thought occurred to him. Could he use his observation skill on himself? His curiosity piqued, he activated the skill. To his surprise, it worked, displaying his own profile, Theo Ragnar. The title Imbecile of Ragnar was still present, but his talents included Player, Ragnar, and Observation, with 4 additional talents marked as Denied Access. His status indicated a strong yearning for the awakening ceremony, while his level remained at 1. The system listed his stats: Strength 13, Dexterity 14, Vitality 12, Magic Power 190, Intelligence 11, and Luck -49. A notification popped up, explaining that his stats were now perceivable as numerical values. Theo noted the categorization of his talents and wondered if completing more quests would unlock the hidden abilities. He was pleased to see his high magic power, a combination of his past life's experiences and the dragon heart strength. However, the negative luck stat puzzled him. Was he cursed? Had the misfortunes of his previous life been due to this low luck value? He deactivated the skill, determined to find a way to increase his luck stat. Before he could dwell on it further, the sound of approaching footsteps caught his attention. He turned to see several knights watching him intently. Evelyn observed the scene, crossing her arms. Rendon may have been a weak swordsman, she commented, but he was still mid-rank, defeating him and earning Julius's approval. It makes you a figure to be envied or admired. The knights gathered around Theo seemed to fall into the latter category. They had witnessed his spar with Sybil and whispered among themselves, confirming that the rumors were indeed true. Could we have blocked those strikes if we were in Sybil's place? One knight murmured. Among them, Auden Nalin stood out. He wanted to spar with Theo but hesitated to speak up. Sensing his apprehension, Theo used observation on him. Auden was 19 years old, the pillar of the Nalin Viscount, and a low-ranked swordsman. His talent was listed as passion and perseverance, and his status revealed a strong desire to challenge Theo. With a small sigh, Theo called out, "Auden, isn't it?" The young man's eyes widened in surprise. "You know my name, young master?" he stammered. Theo simply gestured for him to step forward. "Come on, let's have a spar," he said, his tone commanding but not unkind. Auden's face lit up with excitement, and he quickly drew his sword. "It would be an honor," he exclaimed, introducing himself as the third son of Viscount Nalin and practitioner of the double ascension sword style. Theo nodded, repeating his own introduction. "Theo Ragnar of Rose Palace. Let's see what you've got." The two rushed at each other, their swords clashing in a resounding echo. As they sparred, Theo's basic swordsmanship proficiency increased. Auden pulled back, gathering momentum, and swung with a force aimed at Theo's neck. Theo reacted swiftly, blocking the blow and pushing Auden's sword aside. His changing heart swordsmanship proficiency also increased. Auden, stunned by Theo's skill, took a step back and admitted defeat, his voice shaky. I lost," he said, struggling to catch his breath. The system informed Theo that he had gained Auden's approval, and his luck increased by 1 point. Theo raised an eyebrow at the notification, wondering if earning people's respect could truly affect his luck. Did it also track his reputation? Before he could ponder the implications, another knight stepped forward, and Theo's attention snapped back to the present. He continued challenging his opponents one after another. Each victory earned him their approval, and each approval seemed to nudge his luck upward. Bennett Romero's respect granted him another point, followed by Eric Morin, then Manfred Monbert. With each duel, his confidence grew. As he took a brief pause to catch his breath, Theo glanced at the gathered knights. "Who's next?" he called out. But when no one stepped forward, he opened his status window, only to find that despite all the duels, his quest progress had increased by just 1%. Confused, he wondered if it was because these knights already held some respect for him. If that were the case, then defeating them wasn't enough to truly discard the title of Imbecile of Ragnar. He would need to aim higher. He needed more than just a series of sparring matches. He had to challenge stronger opponents or prove himself in front of those who still doubted his worth. A different kind of event was necessary, something that could capture the attention of everyone. Just then, a voice from behind broke his thoughts. "You look exhausted. Are you sure you're all right?" The voice asked. Theo turned to see a young man approaching. "I'll rest when it's absolutely necessary, but for now I'm fine," Theo replied, his tone steady. The figure stepped into the light, revealing himself as none other than Remington Narcio, one of the 4 hounds of the North. Theo's eyes widened in shock. Remington was part of a prestigious group known for their exceptional talent, which included Hulkus Lank, Ray Ragnar, Action Ragnar of Camellia Palace, and Remington himself. They were the strongest warriors of their generation in the Ragnar clan. Remington introduced himself, his gaze unwavering. "I came early because I was curious about you, Theo. I wanted to see your swordsmanship firsthand before the awakening ceremony." Intrigued, Theo activated his observation skill and learned more about his would-be opponent. Remington, 17 years old, carried the title of Deputy Clan Head of Narcio and was also known as the Silver Lion of the 4 Hounds. His talents included sword genius, keen senses, and extremely hard worker. His status showed surprise at discovering an unexpected rival. Raising his sword, Remington thanked Theo for giving him this opportunity. "I've heard the stories, and now I'd like to test my skills against yours." Theo took a deep breath, feeling honored and a bit daunted. He never imagined he would get the chance to face the legendary sword genius Remington Narcio, a figure he had admired from afar. Though his quest was still ongoing, the chance to fight Remington was all that mattered now. "It's a privilege to cross swords with the famed Deputy Clan Head of Narcio," Theo said respectfully, raising his sword. Remington nodded, his eyes glinting with excitement. "Let's see what you're made of, Theo Ragnar," he replied as they both assumed their stances. As Theo took position, he couldn't help but wonder if his current skills would be enough to challenge one of the 4 hounds of the North. Their swords clashed, the sound ringing out like a thunderclap. The force of the collision sent vibrations through Theo's arms. Just as the battle began, the system notified him that his tutorial quest progress had increased by 1%. But as they exchanged blows, the impact caused one of their swords to shatter into pieces, the fragments scattering across the ground. The knights watching gasped as half of the broken blade landed at Theo's feet. "It's Theo's sword," one of the spectators muttered in disbelief. Sybil, who had been cheering for Theo, shouted in shock, "That can't be!" But another knight, Manuel, shook his head. It was inevitable. No matter how much Theo's improved, going up against one of the 4 hounds is a different story. Yet, to everyone's surprise, Remington sheathed his own sword and turned to face Theo. "It looks like I've lost this one," he declared, his tone sincere. "My sword was already worn out, and I'm exhausted. In a proper duel, I would have been defeated." Theo's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the broken hilt. "No one would make such excuses on the battlefield," he said, shaking his head. "The moment I lost my sword, I lost the duel." A smile tugged at Remington's lips, and he extended his hand. "You're an honest man, Theo. I hope we get to duel properly next time," he said as their hands met in a firm shake. The crowd buzzed with astonishment as Sybil raised his voice above the din, calling out, "Our young master is different." Even Remington acknowledged him. Evelyn breathed a quiet sigh of relief as the system informed Theo that his quest had now reached 35%. He glanced at Remington, a newfound respect in his eyes. Theo knew that while he had grown stronger through the talents and secret techniques granted by the system, he still had a long way to go before he could match Remington's raw skill. The brief duel had shown him that despite the power he had gained, there was still room for growth. Though he felt some disappointment that the fight had ended so abruptly, he also felt a sense of accomplishment. His luck had increased by 10 points, and his reputation had improved noticeably, but his quest progress remained frustratingly slow. It became clear that he would need a much bigger stage or event to make a significant leap forward. Remington's voice broke into his thoughts as he called out to Theo once more. I didn't come here just to spar, he said, pulling an envelope from his cloak. He handed it to Theo, who eyed it curiously. This is an invitation to join the Scaled Dragon Society. The announcement stunned Sybil, who had watched the exchange with wide eyes. The Scaled Dragon Society? He blurted out. It was a prestigious group, rumored to include the best and brightest preparing for the awakening ceremony. That Remington himself had extended the invitation to Theo was almost unheard of. Theo's surprise was evident as he hesitated. Are you sure someone like me belongs in such a famous group? He asked, still uncertain of Remington's motives. Remington chuckled, waving away Theo's doubts. It's not as serious as it sounds. The Scaled Dragon Society is more of a social circle for our peers, a place to train and exchange ideas before the ceremony. It's not all action and battles, though there will be plenty of that, he added with a grin. Sybil's curiosity got the better of him. But why invite Theo? He asked, while Bennett, standing nearby, looked ready to burst into tears from sheer excitement. Theo wasn't entirely sure of Remington's reasoning either, but he quickly realized that joining the Scaled Dragon Society could be the perfect opportunity to advance his quest. The society was bound to attract those who looked down on him, and it would also allow him to gather valuable information on Action and Camellia Palace. There was no reason to refuse. With a nod, Theo accepted the envelope and thanked Remington for the invitation. I'll be there, he confirmed, his voice firm. The knights whispered amongst themselves, astonished that Theo had been offered a place in such an exclusive group. The system notified him that his quest progress had increased by another 1%, inching him closer to his goal. Remington clapped a hand on Theo's shoulder. Glad to hear it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. The next meeting is in 2 weeks, he said before turning to leave. Evelyn, who had been observing quietly from the sidelines, lit her cigar and exhaled thoughtfully. Back at Rose Palace, Theo was caught off guard when his mother, Cecilia, burst into his room with a flurry of maids behind her. Theo, I heard about the invitation to the Scaled Dragon Society, she exclaimed, excitement coloring her voice. Theo, still reeling from the unexpected visit, stammered, Mother, I was just about to. But Cecilia wasn't listening. She was already instructing the maids to assess his wardrobe, deciding which colors would suit him best. The Scaled Dragon Society includes some of the most brilliant talents, like Action of Camellia Palace and Remington, she explained, her hands measuring his shoulders. The council pays attention to everything. How you dress, how you carry yourself, it all matters. As the maids fussed over him, Cecilia continued with a reassuring smile. Don't worry, I used to be an actress, remember? I'll make sure your presentation is flawless. Theo knew that his status as the illegitimate son of a concubine had always weighed heavily on his mother. She had suffered silently in the cold, ruthless Ragnar clan, especially with a son who was often dismissed as lacking. Cecilia suddenly pulled him into a tight embrace. You're my son, Theo, she whispered fiercely. I've always believed in you, and now, I know you can do this. Theo felt a lump in his throat as he returned the hug. You don't need to worry anymore, Mother, he assured her. The room seemed to grow warmer, filled with an unspoken bond of shared determination. The maids were moved by the display, and Cecilia's voice rang with pride as she declared, My son is going to the Scaled Dragon Society. 2 weeks later, on the night of the Scaled Dragon Society's banquet, Remington stood outside Rose Palace, waiting for Theo's arrival. His eyes widened as Theo emerged, impeccably dressed, his bearing confident. Cecilia and the servants cheered him on, wishing him luck. Remington could hardly believe the transformation. Is that really you, Theo? He asked, a touch of wonder in his voice. You look like an entirely different person. Theo chuckled and waved a hand dismissively. Stop teasing me, Remington. But Remington shook his head, his smile genuine. I mean it. You've come a long way. As they climbed into the carriage together, Theo couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. And on the challenges still to come. Theo couldn't deny that he did feel different. He had grown taller, his muscles were more defined, and the past 2 weeks of rigorous training had sharpened him both physically and mentally. During that time, Remington had been a near-constant presence, visiting daily to spar and guide him. They had grown closer, though Evelyn often sighed in exasperation, reminding Theo that she had only intended to teach him for a short while. Yet somehow, she had been pulled into a much more involved process. Theo would just avert his gaze whenever Evelyn expressed her frustrations, knowing how exhausting the past weeks had been, especially with Remington's daily presence. It hadn't helped that Remington's enthusiasm often pushed him to go further, earning more than one frustrated facepalm from Evelyn. As the carriage rattled along the cobblestone road, Remington turned to Theo. "Is this your first banquet?" he asked casually. Theo nodded. "Yes, it is." Remington gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, you'll do fine," he said. "But there's one thing I should mention, my friend, Action." "Action?" Theo echoed, raising an eyebrow. The name was familiar, but Remington's tone carried a hint of warning. "He can be mischievous," Remington explained. "But don't take it too harshly. It was actually Action who extended the invitation. He even went as far as to prepare the banquet in your honor." Theo's brow furrowed in surprise. "Action invited me?" He wasn't expecting that. The pieces seemed to be falling into place a little too perfectly. Still, Theo forced a smile. "Well, I'm looking forward to it," he said, though he fully expected that the evening would come with its share of insults and challenges. If Action had set this up, there was sure to be more than a few surprises waiting for him. Meanwhile, at Camellia Palace, Action Ragnar stood in the lavish banquet hall, swirling a glass of wine in his hand with a smirk playing on his lips. "The imbecile of Ragnar," he murmured to himself, already entertained by the thought of Theo's arrival. In his mind, Theo was a new toy, and tonight's festivities were merely a game. The carriage rolled to a stop, and the driver announced their arrival. Remington stepped down first, followed by Theo. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the imposing structure of Camellia Palace. This place had once been the source of his family's downfall, a den of intrigue where Rendon had been manipulated, where his mother had been disregarded, and where Rose Palace's future had been consumed. He felt the old bitterness creep in, but he quickly pushed it down. Now wasn't the time for emotions. "Shall we?" Remington asked, gesturing toward the entrance. Theo nodded. As they walked, Remington mentioned that Action would be greeting him personally, a rare gesture, even for someone of Theo's status. "A personal greeting from Action? He must be taking an interest," Remington said. But Theo's mind was elsewhere. He knew Action's reputation for meddling and suspected that his so-called warm welcome would come with a sting. He wouldn't be caught off guard. Suddenly, a blue light flickered at the corner of his vision, reflecting off his earrings. He looked up, seeing a faint glow coming from one of the upper rooms. It was the telltale sign of a quest marker. Was there something hidden within Camellia Palace? Before he could dwell on it, Remington called out his name in alarm. Theo spun around just in time to see something falling from above. There was a loud crash as the object hit the ground, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Remington rushed to Theo's side, his voice rising in concern. "Theo, are you all right?" Emerging from the dust, Theo dusted off his clothes, revealing a thin layer of white powder. "I'm fine," he said almost casually. "It was just a sack of flour." Remington's expression turned to one of fury as he looked up at the balcony. "Who would pull such a stunt?" he demanded. Theo shook his head, brushing the flour off his shoulders. In his previous life, he would have been caught completely off guard, covered in powder and humiliated. Now he had dodged it effortlessly. His gaze shifted toward Remington, a fleeting suspicion passing through his mind. Could Remington have been involved? But a quick glance at Remington's status using observation confirmed that his confusion was genuine. Remington hadn't been in on it. Theo glanced back up, and his suspicions landed squarely on Action. And sure enough, there he was, standing on the balcony with an amused grin. "How was my greeting?" Action called down, his voice dripping with mockery. "Just a friendly welcome, you understand." Basic courtesy among peers. Remington's jaw clenched as he shot a glare at Action. Was this really necessary, Action? He shouted. But Action merely shrugged. Oh, come on, Remington. You're not actually upset, are you? It's just a playful greeting between brothers. Theo activated his observation skill and took a closer look at Action. The system revealed his title, Dark Tiger, an apprentice swordsman like Theo, with talents such as madness, psychopath, and overwhelming swordsmanship talent. His current status read, Excited, views Theo as a new toy. Theo's lips curled into a smile. Thank you for the warm welcome, he said loudly, surprising Action. It's not every day that someone goes to such lengths to make me feel at home. I appreciate it. Action tilted his head, momentarily caught off guard by the response. Well, he said, his voice laced with amusement. It's been a long time since I had this much fun. You've changed, Theo. They entered the grand banquet hall, and Theo could hear the whispers and murmurs ripple through the crowd. The guests were puzzled by Action's intentions. Why invite someone like Theo, who was often ridiculed as the imbecile of the Ragnar family, to a prestigious Scaled Dragon Society event? As Theo walked through the room with Remington by his side, a glass of wine in his hand, he could hear the guests speculating. Do you think Action's just going to toy with him? One person whispered. It wouldn't be the first time, another replied. Why else would he go through the trouble of inviting Theo? Remington, looking visibly uncomfortable, leaned over to Theo. I'm sorry about all this. They're usually not this hostile, he said quietly. Theo took a sip of his wine, unfazed. It's all right. Let them talk, he replied with a calm smile. Inwardly, he was pleased. All the gossip and sneering would only make his victory sweeter when he turned their expectations on their heads. His gaze wandered to the upper floor, where the blue quest marker was still faintly visible. He was certain there was a hidden opportunity here, but for now it was out of reach. Just then, Action approached, his expression one of mock concern. Enjoying the party, Theo? He asked. Theo kept his composure, returning the smile. I am, actually. Thank you for the invitation, he said politely. Action's grin widened, and he placed a hand on Theo's shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a threat than a welcome. I may have gone a bit overboard earlier, he admitted, his voice dripping with insincerity. Forgive me. Before Theo could answer, Remington's voice cut through the tension, his tone sharp. Action, that's enough. But Theo surprised them all by shaking his head. No apology necessary, he said with a shrug. I only remember a friendly greeting. Action stared at him, momentarily stunned, then let out a laugh. You've certainly become more entertaining. I had no idea you were like this, he said, raising his voice just enough for the other guests to hear. You've changed a lot, Theo. I think I like you more and more. The laughter from the guests was immediate, with some calling Theo Action's lapdog, and others scoffing that an illegitimate child like him could never measure up to the noble blood of the Troyvan family. How can someone like Theo, born of a commoner, compare to the lineage of the Troyvan swordsmanship? One guest sneered. Theo remained calm, though anger simmered beneath his composed exterior. He noticed the guests had shifted their gossip to Remington. Why is Remington so close to Theo? One man whispered. He's illegitimate too, another chimed in. It makes sense they'd stick together. The mention of Remington's illegitimacy caused a sudden hush to fall over the room. The knight who had spoken realized too late that he had crossed a line. Remington's lineage was a forbidden topic. Theo saw the sadness flash in Remington's eyes, and his own anger flared hotter. Action, Theo called out, his voice carrying across the room. Should I introduce myself to my new friends? He strode over to a table, grabbed a bottle of wine, and approached the knight who had insulted Remington. The man's face paled as Theo drew near, stammering nervously. I didn't mean... Theo didn't wait for him to finish. With a swift motion, he smashed the bottle over the man's head, sending shards and wine spraying everywhere. The room erupted in shocked gasps, with even Action and Remington frozen in disbelief. The man cried out in pain, clutching the side of his bleeding head. "You bastard!" He spat at Theo, but Theo responded with a swift, unflinching kick to the man's head, sending him sprawling to the ground. His tone calm and almost casual, Theo leaned over him. "Bastard," he echoed. "Now that's just hurtful. I was only returning the friendly greeting you offered." The other guests froze, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. Panic rippled through the room as whispers erupted, questioning if this was truly the imbecile of Ragnar that everyone had assumed him to be. As the murmur spread, Theo's tutorial quest progress surged to 43%. Remington watched in stunned silence, realizing this wasn't the same timid Theo he once knew. Had Theo planned all of this, putting on the show for his sake? Meanwhile, Theo remained poised over the fallen man, his smile cold and unyielding. "I've extended my welcome," he said softly, then stepped down on the man's arm, gripping it firmly. "Maybe it's time for you to say your goodbyes." With a quick, brutal twist, he snapped the man's arm. The bone cracked, the sound barely audible, but the effect unmistakable. The man screamed in agony, collapsing into a heap on the floor. Theo let go and turned his gaze to the rest of the room. "Anyone else want to say hello?" he asked casually. His quest progress jumped again, soaring to 66%. At that moment, guards sprang into action, emerging from the shadows and surrounding Theo with their swords drawn. "Harm the young master," one shouted, "and you'll pay for it with your life." They aimed their blades at Theo's throat, their expressions fierce and unyielding. Theo wasn't surprised. He knew exactly who the man he'd just humbled was: Ian Hanabi, the third young master of the Hanabi clan, one of the 6 snow clans loyal to Ragnar. This was precisely why he had come to the Scaled Dragon Society. It was teeming with enemies. Theo faced the guards without a hint of fear. "I know the Hanabi clan's place," he said, his voice carrying a chill that cut through the tension. "I'm well aware you wouldn't sit idly by while the so-called imbecile you've always looked down upon suddenly fights back." He glanced at the guards with disdain. "But tell me," he continued, "so what if Ian is the young master of the Hanabi clan? Do you think that matters?" His words sent a shiver through the nights. He followed up with a sharper question, his tone slicing like a blade. "Do the dogs of a Ragnar Bannerman clan dare demand my death? Are you prepared to take responsibility for such words?" The guards hesitated, fear seizing their limbs. Could this truly be the same Theo Ragnar they had always dismissed? One of the knights suddenly grasped the gravity of the situation. As a direct descendant of Ragnar, Theo possessed the right of succession. Ragnar ruled over the north, and any challenge to his bloodline, especially a death threat, was a crime so severe that the annihilation of an entire clan would not be considered an overreaction. The knight understood that while this power hadn't applied to Theo for a long time, it did now. They needed to apologize and fast. But before any of them could utter a word, Theo gave the order, "Kill them." The air flashed with steel as a blade moved like a gust of wind, severing the heads of the guards who had dared point their weapons at him. Theo stood there, unflinching, as the bodies thudded to the ground. Gasps of horror filled the room, and even Action and Remington were caught off guard by the abrupt violence. Theo's quest progress surged to 70%. In the midst of the chaos, Evelyn emerged, striding forward with a measured step. "When did you realize I was following you?" she asked, her tone calm. Theo looked at her, unperturbed. "It was obvious," he replied. "I didn't know why you were there, but knowing you were gave me the confidence to turn the tables." Their eyes met, and the room fell into a tense, deafening silence. The night before, Julius had been sipping a glass of fine wine in a dimly lit room. He glanced at Evelyn, who stood across from him. "You always said you wouldn't take on any more disciples," he remarked, swirling the wine in his glass. "So, how do you find your new student, Theo?" Evelyn, never one for small talk, raised an eyebrow. "Don't you have better places to be?" she replied dryly. "You only stay close by because I've retired." Julius chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. Tormenting you has become one of my few pleasures. But really, what do you think of Theo? With a sigh, Evelyn pointed to the expensive bottle of wine. That's a costly vintage, Julius, she noted. But he simply took another sip and waited for her answer. Finally, Evelyn conceded. Theo has far exceeded my expectations. In both attitude and skill, he's the most promising student I've ever trained. More promising than Action? Julius asked, his curiosity piqued. Action passed through your hands once, didn't he? Evelyn nodded. Yes, and Theo's potential surpasses even his. I'm not saying this lightly. Julius leaned back, a gleam in his eye. You've always had an eye for talent, he said. But are you sure this isn't just a case of him hiding his true strength all this time? It's possible, Evelyn admitted. Though it's strange that someone who kept their abilities hidden would suddenly decide to flaunt them. It feels like he's being chased by something, and that worries me. Julius grinned at her concern. It's likely because of Action. But if you're so worried, why not follow him to the Scaled Dragon Society? Evelyn frowned. What do you mean? When young wolves gather in search of blood, the hierarchy becomes solidified. Something is bound to happen, Julius explained. He set down a folded white armored dragon cavalry uniform on the table in front of her. While you're there, you might as well tempt him into joining the cavalry. Evelyn's eyes widened as she glanced at the uniform. Julius made his way to the door, pausing to add with a playful smirk. You can't retire just because I can't ride a dragon. Besides, you need to take responsibility for the student you introduced. Waving goodbye, he added, The wine was excellent, by the way. Back at Camellia Palace, Evelyn's gaze followed Theo intently. It dawned on her that he had orchestrated this entire scenario, knowing she was following him. Had he come to the Scaled Dragon Society with this very plan in mind? He was far from ordinary indeed. Theo had sensed Evelyn's presence the moment he boarded the carriage. His dragon heart granted him a heightened perception, an almost supernatural sixth sense. Knowing she was nearby had been a comfort, allowing him to push events to the brink. And now, the stage was set for the final act of his plan. He turned to Evelyn. Most of the people here have shown disrespect to a successor candidate, he said with a steady voice. What's the punishment for such a crime? The room seemed to hold its breath as Evelyn answered. According to clan law, immediate execution is permissible. A cold smile crept across Theo's face. Since these offenders are children who haven't even undergone their awakening ceremony, I'd say we can be lenient, he remarked. Take one of their arms. That should suffice. Without hesitation, Evelyn darted forward. Her blade gleamed as it sliced through the air, severing the arm of the first noble in her path. Second son of the Byron clan, she announced coolly. She moved swiftly through the room, cutting off the arms of the first son of the Red and White Mercenary Corps, the fourth daughter of the Ceres Merchant Guild, the third son of the Clark clan, and the first daughter of the Howard clan. With each strike, Theo's tutorial quest progress climbed steadily, 72%, 76%, and finally 79%. Desperate, one noble clutched at Action's trousers, begging him to intervene. Action stared down at him with a bemused expression. Why should I? He scoffed. It's just a greeting, after all. The man stammered in disbelief, struggling to comprehend Action's callous response. But before he could utter another word, Evelyn's blade flashed through the air, severing his arm in a swift, clean cut. He fell to the ground, writhing in pain as Evelyn calmly announced, The first son of the Purrink family has been dealt with. She then raised her sword to her forehead in a respectful gesture toward Action. It has been a while, she said, her tone measured. Action's eyes narrowed as he and Evelyn locked gazes. I didn't expect to see you here under such circumstances, he remarked, his voice laced with both curiosity and annoyance. As the exchange unfolded, the system notified Theo that his quest progress had jumped to 82%. Action quickly grasped that Evelyn had strategically targeted only those who had insulted Theo's bloodline. That left him unable to intervene, even as a fellow successor candidate. The realization grated on him. His hands were tied while Evelyn continued her grim work. He watched as she approached Theo and reported, "The right arms of the 14 individuals you named have been cut." Remington, looking both awestruck and anxious, stepped forward alongside Evelyn. "Well done," Theo praised, his voice cool and steady. He then asked, "What is the condition of the wounded?" Evelyn's reply was calm, almost detached. "If they hurry to a priest, the severed limbs can be reattached. But whether they will ever wield a sword properly again is uncertain." "Perfect," Theo responded with a small, satisfied nod. Remington's brows furrowed with concern as he turned to Theo. "Are you all right?" he asked hesitantly. Meanwhile, Action stood on the sidelines, observing the exchange. He saw how both Remington and Evelyn had become captivated by Theo's actions. The change in the so-called imbecile of Rose Palace was undeniable. Though he couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all, there was a seething rage brewing beneath the surface. The urge to crush Theo, to wipe that calm expression off his face, was growing stronger. Theo, unperturbed, turned to leave, his movements steady and unhurried. "It's time to go," he said to Evelyn and Remington. Evelyn nodded immediately, and Remington, stuttering, quickly agreed to follow. As Theo passed by Action, he lightly tapped him on the arm and gave a small, knowing smile. "I enjoyed the evening," he remarked. With those words, the system confirmed that Theo had completed his 4th tutorial quest. Walking away with confidence, Theo added, "We'll see each other again soon." His voice was calm, but the underlying message was unmistakable. Behind him, Action's expression twisted in fury. He called out Theo's name, his voice booming through the grand hall, but the system's display was clear. All tutorial quests completed. The days when anyone would call him the imbecile of Ragnar were over. Theo exited Camellia Palace with his head held high, knowing that while the tutorial quests had ended, his true quest for vengeance had only just begun. His reward, an experience elixir capable of leveling him up 5 times, usable only below level 30, was just the beginning. Later, back at Camellia Palace, Amel was in her office, busy with paperwork, when a servant rushed in to report the events of the evening. Her pen froze mid-stroke as the details unfolded. "Say that again," she demanded, her tone sharp and incredulous. The servant repeated himself, confirming the chaos that had erupted at Action's Scaled Dragon Society meeting. Amel's face grew pale as the implications sank in, while her brother, Ed, who had been sitting nearby, exchanged a glance with her, both of them speechless. Meanwhile, at the Rose Palace Inn, Sybil lifted his glass high, his face flushed with excitement. "A toast," he cried, "to our young Master Theo's unbelievable debut in high society." The crowd roared in agreement, glasses clinking together in celebration. As the festive atmosphere enveloped him, Theo felt a rare sense of relief wash over him. He took a swig of his beer, savoring the moment of victory, surrounded by people who were beginning to feel like his own. Back at Camellia Palace, a loud slap echoed through the halls, reverberating from one of the private chambers. Inside, Amel furiously confronted Action, her face flushed with anger. "You fool!" she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "You handed Theo Ragnar justification to act. You let his people's arms get chopped off. And for what?" Action's response was indifferent, his tone flat. "Yes." The simplicity of his answer only fueled Amel's fury. "Do you really think any of this makes sense?" she snapped. "How many times have I warned you not to take Theo lightly? And now, look at the mess you've created." Her eyes narrowed as she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Forget about pressuring him into submission. You've just given him the grounds to go wild." She paced back and forth, her anger palpable. "I told you, once Theo Ragnar started to stand out, it would become infinitely harder to take control of Rose Palace. But no, you just couldn't resist your childish games." Action tried to reassure his mother, his tone placating. "There's no need to worry. Don't patronize me, Action." Amel cut him off, her voice sharp. You almost ruined our entire plan for the sake of your shallow amusement. Reflect on your actions, or you'll do more than just risk our grand design. Action gritted his teeth, offering a reluctant nod. I'll keep that in mind, he said before storming out of the room. As the door slammed shut, Amel let out a frustrated sigh. Who does he take after to be so impulsive? She muttered to herself. From the shadows, a voice replied. He takes after you when you were young. Startled, Amel turned to see her brother Ed step forward, a smirk on his lips. Very funny? Amel replied, her tone laced with sarcasm. Are you here to mock me? Or do you have something useful to say? Ed's smile widened. I wouldn't worry so much, dear sister. The situation might not be as dire as you think. Amel's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? Ed began to explain. You see, Rose Palace has always been part of the clan head's harem, a place with his tacit protection. While it's largely been overlooked as a gathering of riffraff, taking control of it requires a legitimate reason. He folded his arms, continuing. Fortunately for us, Theo's little spectacle tonight provided the chaos we needed. As he continues to establish himself as the representative of Rose Palace, we can use this incident as grounds for intervention. Amel's expression shifted from anger to intrigue. You mean? Ed nodded. Yes. We can manipulate the situation using legal procedures under the guise of discipline. By positioning ourselves as enforcers of order, we can quietly suppress Theo's influence and solidify our control over Rose Palace without causing an uproar. A slow smile spread across Amel's face as she closed her ornate fan. How long will it take to prepare everything? Ed's eyes gleamed with confidence. The preparations are already complete. By the time you wake up tomorrow, you'll have the news you've been waiting for. He handed her a small aromatic candle. I had this imported from the volcanic regions of South Archon. A gift. Rest well tonight. Amel embraced her brother warmly. I expect nothing less from you, Ed. It's why I trust you so completely. Meanwhile, at the Rose Palace Inn, Remington approached Theo with a curious expression. I never realized. You cared so much, he said, his voice filled with a mix of wonder and confusion. Theo raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Remington elaborated. At the Scaled Dragon Society, you didn't hesitate to defend me. While you endured the insults aimed at yourself, the moment they turned on me, you stepped in without a second thought. He hesitated, his voice lowering. I was embarrassed. I couldn't do anything myself. But you. Remington's expression softened. You've changed, Theo. You've become stronger, more resolute. Theo's eyes flickered with surprise as he listened. It seemed Remington had completely misunderstood his intentions. Remington's voice became firmer. From now on, I want to follow you, he declared, his voice carrying a newfound determination. The room erupted in cheers, the crowd shouting, The strong recognize the strong. Theo, caught off guard, began to protest. Wait, Remington, you've got it all wrong. But before he could explain, he heard a familiar voice inside his mind. Just let him be. Evelyn's voice echoed softly. Stunned, Theo turned to see her standing nearby, a knowing smile on her lips. Telepathy? He wondered, his mind racing. Evelyn gave him a subtle nod, her smile widening. Sometimes, she said, it's best to let things take their own course. Using telepathy, Evelyn's voice resonated gently in Theo's mind. It's not a bad misunderstanding, she reassured him. Perhaps everyone just wants to get along with you. Surprised by the notion, Theo let out a quiet sigh, his thoughts drifting. He didn't see himself as anyone special. Everything, the regression, the latent power of Ragnar's talent, and his newfound strength, felt almost like they were handed to him by the mysterious system. Yet he couldn't dismiss how real it all felt. Theo began pondering the nature of the system. At first, he thought it might simply be a manifestation of his own regrets and ambitions. But the details it provided were far too precise for that. There was a vague sense of déjà vu about it, as though some part of him had encountered this kind of phenomenon before. But whatever it was, it had undeniably helped him, and for now, that was all that mattered. Glancing at his stats, he noticed how the Scale Dragon Society incident had advanced his level, granting him points to distribute across his abilities. The realization that he could deliberately shape his strength was both exhilarating and terrifying. He felt an odd smile tug at his lips, one that didn't go unnoticed by Evelyn. Her eyes flickered with a hint of confusion, unsettled by the expression she saw. Refocusing, Theo understood that the next move had to come soon. Camellia Palace wouldn't take his recent actions lying down, and a counterattack was inevitable. He turned to Remington. "Remy," he said casually, catching the young swordsman off guard. "Could you help me with something?" Remington's face lit up at the friendly nickname. "Of course," he replied eagerly. "You can count on me for anything." He seemed thrilled by the notion that Theo had called him Remy in such a familiar way, as if it signaled a bond between them. Handing him a piece of paper, Theo's expression grew serious. "The war for the throne between me and Action is about to intensify," he said. "We need to prepare." For a moment, Remington's eyes widened. He wasn't expecting Theo to speak so directly about the brewing conflict. Theo knew that Remington, in the future, would become the clan head of the Narcio family, a force powerful enough to challenge the Ragnars. Securing his allegiance now could make all the difference. Theo extended the paper to Remington, silently hoping he would accept. After a moment's hesitation, Remington took it, his eyes burning with conviction. "I swear to follow you, Theo," he declared. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." Theo's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you, Remy," he said, acknowledging the swordsman's pledge of loyalty. Just as Remington was about to express his excitement over the nickname again, a voice boomed from outside. The inn's door swung open with a loud crash, and a higher-ranking knight, one of the swords of law, stepped in, his face stern and unyielding. The knight brandished a warrant in the air. "Theo Ragnar," he declared, "you are under arrest for threats, assault, and intimidation." The room fell into stunned silence. Evelyn was the first to react, her voice brimming with outrage. "What kind of nonsense is this?" she shouted, glaring at the knight. Theo, however, remained composed. "Stay calm," he said to the others, standing up with a reassuring smile. He approached the warrant, noting that the ink was still fresh, proof that the accusation had been hastily fabricated. "I'll cooperate," Theo said, extending his hands forward. "Let's proceed." The captain of the Swords of Law cuffed him, and Theo followed them out of the inn. As he was led away, the crowd inside the inn voiced their concerns, calling after him with worry in their eyes. But Theo glanced back at them with a calm smile that left Remington and Evelyn speechless. His demeanor was so composed that it seemed almost as if he had planned this turn of events. As his figure disappeared from sight, Remington's gaze fell to the piece of paper Theo had given him. His mind raced with uncertainty and questions about what Theo had truly intended. The next day at Rose Palace, Cecilia was beside herself with shock. The butler had just relayed the news, and her legs gave way, causing her to sink to her knees. "Is it true?" she gasped, her voice trembling. "Theo, taken to the tribunal?" The butler rushed to her side, his expression full of concern. Cecilia waved him off gently. "I'm all right," she murmured. "What are the charges against him?" "It seems related to the Scale Dragon Society," the butler replied, his tone grim. "The accusation is inciting rebellion." Cecilia's eyes widened, and she struggled to comprehend the severity of the situation. "A rebellion?" she echoed in disbelief. "Surely, it can't be." The butler hesitated before adding, "Given how thoroughly Theo dismantled the Scale Dragon Society, it's unlikely this will end quickly or quietly." Cecilia's heart ached as she wrestled with the magnitude of it all. Could anyone have foreseen that Theo's mere invitation to the Scale Dragon Society would spiral into something so perilous? Her hands clenched as she whispered, "You'll get through this, my son. You always do." Meanwhile, inside the quiet confines of the carriage, Theo stared out at the passing scenery. His thoughts were sharp and clear. He knew what awaited him at the tribunal would not be simple imprisonment. His actions had gone too far for that. A trial was inevitable, and more importantly, they aimed to challenge his qualifications as a successor of Ragnar. The carriage came to a halt at the tribunal's gate, and the knight ordered Theo to step out. As he did so, a faint smile crossed his lips. So they want to crush me completely, he thought. Perfect. The grand courtroom loomed before him as the head knight's voice echoed through the hall. Theo Ragnar has been escorted in, he announced. An official seated at the front gestured for Theo to come forward. He obeyed, his gaze sweeping over the room, confirming the presence of some of the most powerful figures in the realm. There sat Julius, the demon dragon and captain of the white armored dragon cavalry. Ed Trovian, the sky dragon and director of the Central Intelligence Bureau. Osa Ragnar, the sword dragon and lady of Plum Blossom Palace. And at the center was Wolfgang Ragnar, the elder dragon and head counselor. In his previous life, the sight of these titans would have left Theo trembling, barely able to draw breath. But now he was a different man. Theo, Wolfgang called, his voice dripping with disdain. It's been a while. Theo dipped his head respectfully. Indeed, Elder Wolfgang. He was well aware of Wolfgang's loathing for half-bloods. Illegitimate children like him were abominations in the Elder's eyes, and Wolfgang wasn't bothering to hide his disgust. Spare me the pleasantries, Wolfgang growled, cutting to the chase. You're here to answer for your crimes. The Byron clan, the Ceres Merchant Guild, the Red and White Mercenary Corps, and even the Hanabi clan have all expressed their intent to cut ties with the Ragnar family because of your foolishness. His voice rose, laced with fury. You, a mere bastard, dared drag our honor through the mud. Can you bear the consequences of your actions? Theo met Wolfgang's gaze with a calm that unnerved everyone present. You're right, he said. I was careless. There was a momentary pause as Wolfgang's anger seemed to subside slightly. But then Theo's next words sent a shockwave through the room. My mistake, he continued, was not cutting off their heads instead of just their limbs. The silence that followed was palpable as every figure in the courtroom turned to Theo, stunned by his audacity. The nobles you speak of are subjects. Theo went on, his voice gaining strength. And the relationship between a lord and his subjects is founded on land, honor, and loyalty, paid in blood if necessary. That is the essence of chivalry. He lifted his chin, his eyes blazing with resolve. If those who threatened me had shown such insolence from the start, I would have executed them without hesitation. The principles of chivalry must be restored. Wolfgang and Ed sat speechless, dumbfounded by Theo's bold declaration. Julius, on the other hand, couldn't suppress a smile. Impressive as ever, he murmured, quietly amused. Wolfgang's expression darkened, his face red with anger. Are you mocking the council with your sophistry, boy? He shouted, his voice echoing in the grand hall. Osa Ragnar, the sword dragon, interjected before Wolfgang could continue, her calm voice cutting through the tension. Theo's arguments are valid in theory, she said, but Ragnar's greatness has never rested on strength alone. Her gaze swept the room as she continued. If we ignore the voices of our vassals and knights, we will eventually fall. One cannot rule the world through tyranny alone. Wolfgang turned to her in surprise, but Osa maintained her steady tone. Theo gave a respectful nod, acknowledging her wisdom. Your words are true, he said, and I will keep them in mind. Theo knew that Osa was not just the clan head's first wife and the most formidable swordsman in the north. She was also known for her wisdom. Her lack of hostility was a relief, especially given her knowledge of the fate of Rose Palace. However, he was still unsure why she would speak on his behalf. Osa then addressed him directly, her tone firm. Your punishment is justified, she warned. Theo kept his composure and asked calmly, what will the punishment be? Wolfgang, still bristling with anger, declared, you will face 3 months of probation. Theo raised an eyebrow, pointing out, But the awakening ceremony is in 2 months. Wolfgang's temper flared again. How dare you talk back? He snapped. OSA interceded, explaining in an even voice. We have taken that into consideration. You will participate in next year's ceremony instead. The 15 children injured by you will likewise be delayed until then. Ed observed the exchange quietly, noting that Julius's opposition to harsher punishment had likely influenced the lighter sentence. Still, this outcome played into his hands. Being barred from this year's awakening ceremony was a significant dishonor, especially for someone representing Rose Palace. It would give Camellia Palace ample opportunity to overshadow Rose Palace. Once the plan was in motion, Ed believed Theo would be powerless to stop it. If Theo tried to appeal, Ed thought they could always resort to eliminating him. However, he doubted Theo would be that foolish. To everyone's shock, Theo broke the silence. I want to appeal, he announced, his voice unwavering. The dragons in the room were visibly stunned. Ed's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. This fool is playing right into our hands, he thought. Julius's concern was evident as he addressed Theo. Do you understand what appealing truly means? He asked. I do, Theo replied confidently. He was well aware that the 3-month probation was a lenient slap on the wrist, most likely orchestrated by Julius. However, Theo had no intention of accepting even this minor punishment. In the proud and powerful Ragnar clan, appealing was tantamount to declaring war. Theo's voice rang out across the courtroom. In the end, only the victor can speak the truth, he declared. And I intend to be rewarded, not punished. As he spoke, the system notified him that he had entered the main scenario. The dragons were left speechless at his audacity. The system message continued, informing Theo that this scenario would reveal secrets buried deep within the Ragnar clan, encouraging him to succeed. His first scenario quest was titled The Successor's Path. Elsewhere, chaos had erupted at the hidden northern branch of the series' Merchant Guild. The building was ablaze, and a cloaked figure expertly cut down the last of the guild members. As the final blow fell, the figure turned. It was Evelyn. Remington approached her, holding a small chest in his hands. Just as Theo predicted, he said with a smirk. Camellia Palace, under the Trovian name, is finished. Back in the courtroom, Ed, unaware of the destruction unfolding elsewhere, remained confident, thinking that their plans were progressing without a hitch. Once the room calmed, Wolfgang spoke again, incredulous. You would escalate this issue into a full-blown war over a mere probation sentence? He scoffed. Your arrogance knows no bounds. Do you truly believe you can stand alone against the combined forces of the 15 clans? Theo met Wolfgang's gaze steadily. I understand the odds, he said, but in cases where there is a vast power imbalance, it is common to resolve appeals through proxy battles, is it not? Julius's eyes narrowed as he listened. In the Ragnar clan, an appeal usually resulted in an outright war, but when the disparity in power was too great, a proxy battle was used. Each side would choose a representative to duel in their place. Naturally, Theo would represent the defendant, while it was almost certain that action would be chosen for the plaintiff. If that happened, Theo's defeat seemed all but inevitable. Julius wondered if Theo had some hidden strategy or was simply counting on either himself or Evelyn to step forward as his champion. If so, Theo would be sorely disappointed. Theo's voice broke the silence. Let us proceed according to the rules, he said. We will each choose a representative, and the proxy battle will be held in 1 week. He glanced around the room. How does the council feel about this suggestion? Ed, calculating rapidly, believed Theo was indeed banking on either Julius or Evelyn fighting on his behalf. But both were unlikely to intervene, forcing Theo to face action on his own. Ed was about to voice his agreement with Theo's proposal and announce action as the representative when a familiar voice interrupted him. The entire room froze as the courtroom doors swung open. Kyle Ragnar, the clan head, strode in, his presence commanding the attention of everyone present. You've become quite adept at these schemes, haven't you, Theo? He remarked, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. My son, he continued, addressing Theo directly. You have changed a great deal since we last met. Immediately, the dragons in the room bowed deeply, paying their respects to the clan head. Theo followed suit, lowering himself to the ground as he greeted his father. Apprentice swordsman Theo Ragnar at your service, he said, his voice filled with respect. I greet the incarnation of the great dragon god. At that moment, the system provided an update for Theo. His first scenario quest had officially begun. The path of the successor. The objective was to seize control of Camellia Palace and uncover its secrets. Theo's mind raced as he recalled the blue light he had seen earlier. He had been too preoccupied with recent events to investigate further, but it was clear that something crucial awaited him there. For now, however, he had to focus on the present. Theo peered up at his father, realizing that Kyle's unexpected arrival had thrown a dangerous and unpredictable element into the mix. His carefully laid plans could be upended at any moment. Why had his father come? Kyle ordered Theo to rise, which he did without hesitation. The clan head spoke, his tone measured. I happened to hear about the situation on my way to the tribunal. It seems you found yourself in quite the predicament. He paused, his gaze piercing. I understand you wish to resolve the matter through an appeal via proxy battle? Theo confirmed with a nod. That is correct, he said. Kyle studied his son closely. If you intend to proceed with a proxy battle, you must realize that it would be unwise for you to fight personally. His eyes narrowed as he posed the critical question. Who do you intend to choose as your proxy? Ed, sensing the high stakes of this moment, watched closely, his alarm growing. Theo's answer here could alter the course of everything. But Theo wasn't just spitting lines. He knew the so-called proxy battle was just a diversion, bait for the bigger play. His real strategy. The proof of Camellia Palace's treason that he'd tasked Evelyn and Remington with uncovering. That would win the Dano need to fight. Still, it felt good to say exactly what was on his mind. But then, things took a hard left. Kyle, his eyes glinting, told Theo he wanted to offer him a personal opportunity. He wasn't just talking anymore. The room went silent when Kyle announced that he, the Master of Ragnar, wanted to test Theo personally. One strike. If Theo could survive one blow from Kyle, the clan head himself, all charges against Theo would be dropped. Everyone in the room froze, including Theo, who was left standing there, trying to process the sudden change in the script. Kyle didn't wait for Theo to answer. He turned on his heel, barking for Theo to follow him outside for the test. But before Theo could even take a step, Ed, his ever-scheming adversary, exploded into action. Wait, Ed shouted, desperate to intervene. He knew damn well that Kyle acknowledging Theo as a worthy opponent was a game-changer. If Theo survived this hell, if he even stood his ground, it would mean the clan head himself saw potential in him. Ed's mind raced. There was no way Theo could handle Kyle's strike. But if he did, everything would change. Ed wasn't about to let that happen. Vassals and bannermen can't judge the bloodline of the clan head's son, he argued, clinging to formality. He pushed for the proxy battle, hoping to keep things under control. But Kyle wasn't having it. Sky Dragon, Kyle barked, eyes flashing. Shut up. His voice was enough to freeze the blood in Ed's veins. If a vassal speaks like that, get rid of them. Ed was forced to swallow his pride and muttered a reluctant agreement. Kyle turned to Julius, who was stifling laughter. You got something to say? Kyle demanded. Julius, still grinning, shrugged it off. Nah, it's just been a while since you've taken this much interest in something. Kyle waved him off, but the air had shifted. The room was tense, charged. Kyle turned back to Theo. Well, he asked, eyes locked on his son. How about my suggestion? Will you accept? Theo, still processing, felt his plan crumble before him. But he wasn't rattled. If anything, he welcomed the chaos. Smiling, he played along. It's a bit heavy, don't you think? He replied, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. A single strike from the clan head is no light thing, especially compared to a proxy war. Kyle raised a brow. So you're not accepting? Theo quickly clarified. Oh, I'll accept, but the stakes should be adjusted. Kyle's interest peaked. Adjusted how? Theo grinned. Let's make it worth my while. Something like Camellia Palace. The room went dead quiet, as if Theo had just slapped every soul in there. Ed's face twisted in fury. That brat, he muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, Wolfgang thought Theo had lost his damn mind. A deal? With the clan head? It was madness. Theo had no place making such bold demands. But Kyle, to everyone's shock, agreed. You want to be a successor? Kyle said, turning to face Theo. Then you'll need that kind of boldness. He shot a look at Ed, daring him to object. Ed, biting back his rage, could only mutter, Everything belongs to you, my lord. Satisfied, Kyle turned to his council and barked orders to prepare the stage for Theo's trial. Soon enough, they were standing on the stage. On one side stood Kyle and the dragon heads. On the other, Theo, ready to face the impossible. Ed seated internally. His carefully laid trap had backfired, turning into a platform that could elevate Theo instead. But still, Ed reassured himself. There's no way Theo will survive a single strike from Kyle. His imagination ran wild with images of Theo crushed, humiliated, and, better yet, dead. Theo knew what Ed was thinking. Hell, he was counting on it. But Theo had a secret weapon, the tutorial reward. A gift that would make all the difference. Kyle, ever the sharp-eyed master, noticed something was off. Did you consume an elixir? Kyle asked, eyes narrowing. He could sense the change in Theo, though no one else seemed to pick up on it. Still, Kyle shrugged it off. Doesn't matter, he said with a smirk. Theo's still my flesh and blood. Kyle stepped forward, asking Theo if he was ready. Theo, ever cool, nodded. I'm ready, he said. Kyle, amused, told Theo that he'd forego his usual greatsword. After all, Theo didn't know how to use mana yet. Instead, Kyle grabbed a rusty steel sword, something that wouldn't obliterate Theo in a single swing. The other dragon heads, all in agreement, nodded. Of course not, they said. And then it began. Kyle released his aura, and the sheer pressure of it hit Theo like a wall. Theo could barely stand under the force, his body trembling, his knees buckling. Kyle was impressed. You're still standing, he said, raising his sword. Theo grinned through the strain, knowing that his strength stat had nearly tripled thanks to the elixir he received for clearing the tutorial. His level had jumped by 7, and his strength now sat at a solid 52. Kyle lifted the sword, and the world seemed to slow. Every eye was on them. Kyle swung, and the ground exploded under the force of his blow. The air filled with dust and debris as the stage shattered beneath Theo's feet. But when the smoke cleared, Kyle's eyes widened in shock. Theo had blocked the strike. Kyle stepped back, impressed. It's been a long time since I found a son worth keeping, he said, walking away with a smirk. But before Theo could breathe, his sword cracked, shattering to pieces as he collapsed, spent. Ed and Wolfgang stood frozen in disbelief. Julius and OSA, meanwhile, looked on, relieved. Kyle turned to the crowd and announced that Theo had proven his innocence through sheer will. The trial was over. At that moment, the system appeared before Theo, congratulating him for completing the sudden quest. Single strike of Kyle Ragnar. His reward? Inventory authority and the elusive blue key. Theo lay there, exhausted but victorious. His plan had worked, but the path forward was only just beginning. As Theo's vision slowly adjusted to the light streaming in, he saw his mother's tear-streaked face hovering over him. Her expression was a mixture of relief and worry, and he could feel the weight of her concern. "Mother," he whispered, his voice still hoarse from exhaustion. "I'm okay." Cecilia, unable to hold back her emotions, embraced him tightly. "You foolish boy," she cried, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea how terrified I was? When I heard you had faced the clan head's sword, I thought I had lost you." Her arms gripped him as if she could shield him from the world. "Where even are we?" Right on cue, Julia strolled in, dropping news like it was no big deal. By order of the clan head, the former lady of Camellia Palace, Amel, and her little buddies, Action and the director of intelligence, Ed, have been kicked out. Theo blinked, floored. "Wait, does that mean I passed?" Julius flashed a proud grin, confirming it. "Yep, and right now, you're in Camellia Palace." The system chimed in again, letting Theo know the scenario had been updated. He'd completed the Camellia Palace mission. Only one thing left: uncover its secret. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Amel was throwing the tantrum of the century. She stomped around like a kid who didn't get her way, screeching about losing what she thought was hers. Her servant tried, and failed, to get her to chill, but Amel wasn't having it. Inside, Ed was boiling over, practically vibrating with rage as he called Action. His voice cold, he ordered, "Kill Theo Ragnar." Action, in his usual laid-back way, shrugged it off. "Relax. I was already planning to take his arm during the awakening ceremony." But that wasn't enough for Ed. "Take his head instead," he growled, barely holding it together. Noticing how pissed his uncle was, Action realized the situation had just gone from no big deal to, oh crap. Back in the palace, Theo was deep in thought. Things had played out way differently than he'd expected, but he couldn't complain. He'd gotten control of Camellia Palace without even using his ace in the hole. Bonus? He'd snagged a second authority the inventory. Curious, he opened it up and reached inside, pulling out an apple. As he took a bite, he strolled around, still kind of blown away by the whole store stuff in thin air deal. He didn't fully get how it worked, but he knew it was going to come in handy. Reaching in again, he pulled out a blue key. It was labeled as a miscellaneous item with a dungeon opening tag. He glanced over at the room that had been glowing blue earlier and connected the dots. The key and the room were linked. Sliding the key into the lock, he wasn't shocked when it fit perfectly. But when the door swung open, what did surprise him was finding a hidden cave behind it. The system popped up, announcing that he discovered a dungeon for the first time, and that all experience earned inside would be doubled. Theo was floored. Who knew a cave had been stashed inside Camellia Palace? This had to be linked to some kind of quest. Not wanting to miss out on the sweet double XP, he took a step forward, then paused. Yeah, going in empty-handed? Not smart. A moment later, fully loaded with a ridiculous number of swords in his inventory, Theo headed into the dungeon armed with a sword and shield. As he ventured deeper, he heard something. His eyes widened as a massive white wolf appeared before him. The wolf didn't waste any time, it lunged straight at him. Luckily, Theo's reflexes kicked in, and he blocked the beast's jaws with his shield. Pretty strong, he muttered under his breath before slicing at the wolf's side. He wasn't about to let the wolf think it could outmuscle him. But the wolf was fast. It let go of his shield and jumped back, dodging his strike by a hair. The beast snarled, baring its fangs before leaping at him again. Theo didn't back down, he charged right at it, swinging his sword, but the wolf barely flinched, kept coming, relentless. Theo gritted his teeth, bracing with his shield, realizing just how tough this thing really was. It was fast, way too fast. Theo knew his regular attacks weren't gonna cut it. This isn't some ordinary wolf, he thought, his mind racing back to the tales of demonic beasts from the Demon Sea, way beyond the northern wall. This thing could be just as powerful, maybe even worse. The wolf swiped at him with razor-sharp claws, but Theo ducked, barely dodging it. He charged forward, mind flashing to that brilliant ray of light he'd seen when his father executed the single strike. Kyle's attack was flawless, an arc of pure white energy that seemed to split the air itself. Theo raised his sword, trying to imitate the move, and swung down at the wolf, but it dodged easily, just tilting its head like it was nothing. The wolf leaped back, and Theo cursed under his breath. Pulling off that strike was going to be tougher than he thought. He realized then that the single strike wasn't just about swinging hard, it was about pouring everything into one perfect blow that guaranteed death in a single shot. That's the key, he thought, shifting focus. He decided to ditch his shield and go all in on his sword skills and the speed techniques Evelyn had drilled into him. He leapt high into the air, catching the wolf totally off guard. It looked around, confused, just as Theo came crashing down, driving his sword straight into its skull. The wolf howled in pain, blood pouring from its eye as Theo yanked his sword free. He grinned finally, a hit that counted. The wolf, now blind in one eye, growled furiously, but Theo wasn't worried anymore. He knew he had this. With confidence, he dashed toward the injured beast, ready to end the fight for good. 2 months later, at training ground number 4, Ood looked around, noticing more and more people crowding the area. "We might need to move this," Sybil said, nodding at the swelling crowd. Ever since rumors spread that Kyle Ragnar had taught Theo the single strike, people had been coming from all over, eager to test themselves against him. While they were talking, Henry Morris from Plum Blossom Palace swaggered over, sneering. "So, when's your incredible young master gonna show up? It's been 2 months." He chuckled, throwing shade. Maybe Theo's run off now that his big victory stories made the rounds too much. Maybe the whole thing's been exaggerated. Huh? No witnesses at the trial. No proof of his fight with the Scaled Dragon Society. Before Henry could finish, Sybil's fist connected with his face, sending him flying. One of Henry's lackeys started yelling, but shut up real quick when he noticed the knight's glaring daggers at him. Seething, Sybil spat insults at Henry and his crew. "You're nothing compared to Theo." Ood tried to ease the tension with a joke about Sybil's temper, but Sybil, still fuming, wasn't having it. He didn't care about jokes. He was done letting these idiots disrespect their young master. "Draw your swords," Sybil shouted, and his comrades followed suit. The Knights of Plum Blossom Palace did the same, ready for a full-on clash. But before the battle could go nuclear, a figure with long blue hair suddenly appeared, freezing the swords of both sides. The crowd gasped. Everyone recognized Frost Sword Ray Ragnar, one of the 4 Hounds of the North. A moment later, loud laughter echoed across the training ground as another figure made his entrance. Hulkus Lank, aka Black Bear, another of the 4 Hounds, stepped onto the scene. The knights were shook. 2 of the 4 Hounds here? Hulkus, though, looked unimpressed by the crowd. "Where's Theo?" he asked, calling him by his nickname, Luster Tiger. "I'm here to challenge him personally." Meanwhile, deep inside Camellia Palace's dungeon, Theo sat, utterly drained. Sweat dripped down his face as he clutched his half-broken sword. The system wouldn't stop notifying him that he'd leveled up again. He'd been tearing through demonic beasts non-stop, and the tally now stood at 170 down, 1 left. Only 1 beast remained out of 171. Theo leaned against the dead wolf's body, catching his breath. Suddenly, a loud growl echoed from nearby. His status window popped up, showing his current stats. Level 15. Strength, 91. Vitality, 20. Intelligence, 19. Dexterity, 25. Magic power, 198. Luck, 6. Unknown stats, 2. Allocatable stats, 0. Theo pulled a potion from his inventory and downed it in one gulp. Within seconds, his wounds healed, and he felt his strength surge back. He knew he'd come way too close to death more times than he'd like to admit in that dungeon. But those beginner healing potions, restoring a measly 10% of his health, had saved his hide again and again. As he glanced around at the pile of demonic beast bodies he'd left in his wake, Theo couldn't help but think about how brutal those early fights had been. But as he leveled up, the grind got easier. Time had slipped by 2 whole months in this hellhole, and now, only one beast remained. He knew what that meant. The boss fight was up next. Theo ascended the stairs to the 5th floor, where the final challenge waited. He paused, noticing his sword was toast, completely wrecked from the last battle. With a sigh, he tossed the broken blade aside and pulled another from his inventory, a ceremonial sword his mom had given him on his birthday. He looked it over, remembering how he'd dismissed it in his past life, barely even glancing at it. Back then, there'd been tension between him and his mom before the awakening ceremony, and like an idiot, he'd thrown the sword aside, letting it rust. Now, though, he took a moment to really look at it, white snow steel, rare and powerful. He let the memory of that day wash over him. Cecilia had barged into his room, grinning like a kid, wishing him a happy birthday as servants trailed behind her, arms full of gifts. She'd waited until midnight just to surprise him. But in his frustration, Theo had snapped, shouting that with the awakening ceremony coming up, he didn't have time for birthdays or presents. He'd coldly thrown in her face that no amount of shiny gear could change someone's bloodline, leaving her speechless and hurt. Theo regretted that more than anything now, and in this life, he swore he wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. He tightened his grip on the sword and kept moving toward the boss room. The system chimed in, warning him to brace for a strong demonic beast. Stepping into the chamber, his breath hitched. Massive claws, a long tail, and a mouth that could tear through steel. It was a dragon. Or no, just a lesser drake, thankfully. Theo sighed, hell relieved. It wasn't a full dragon, but still, this was no pushover. He remembered the legends of his Ragnar clan descendants of dragons, or so the story said. Seeing the drake now, it all felt too on the nose to be a coincidence. But whatever it meant, one thing was crystal clear. He had to beat the drake to finish this dungeon. The system flashed the last objective of the scenario quest. This was it, the final demonic beast. Theo steadied his breath, gearing up for the battle ahead. Could he really take down a drake? Even a lesser one was still part dragon. He squared his stance and decided to go for the single flash technique. He'd honed that move on the dire wolves in this dungeon. Sure, it wasn't on the same level as his father's dragon flash, but if Theo tapped into his dragon heart, he could definitely land a serious blow. Sword at the ready, he charged forward, focusing his energy. The drake stirred, sensing the danger, but Theo was quicker. With precision, he unleashed the single flash, driving his sword into one of the drake's eyes. Blood gushed from the wound. His plan was working. The drake swung its massive tail at him, but Theo dodged just in time, narrowly avoiding getting crushed. He'd hoped to hit the brain, but he hadn't quite reached that far. Still, he could see the potential. The drake snarled, its rage tangible. Theo gripped his sword tighter and launched himself at it again, activating Jester's footwork. He danced around the drake with blinding speed, slashing as he moved. For a split second, Theo thought he might actually win this. He set up for another strike, planning to distract the drake with a quick hit before going for a weak spot. But before he could follow through, the drake let out a bone-chilling scream. The system flared a warning. Fear ability activated and Theo's body froze. His movements slowed by 10%. The drake's fiery gaze locked onto him, paralyzing him. He couldn't move. Then the drake's claws came crashing down, and though Theo tried to block with his sword, the sheer power sent him flying into the cave wall. He hit hard, blood dripping from his forehead. This wasn't just a boss fight, this was a nightmare, and if he didn't end it soon, things were about to get a whole lot worse. Gritting his teeth, Theo pushed through the pain and charged once more, locking eyes with the beast. As it lunged at him, he spotted the reverse scale on its neck. That was the weak point. As the drake's jaws came down, Theo ducked at full speed and rammed his sword into the exposed scale with everything he had. The blade sank deep into the drake's neck, stopping it cold. But Theo wasn't done. He shoved the sword in even deeper, causing the Drake to scream in agony. For a moment, he smiled his plan had worked. But the Drake wasn't finished. Now fully enraged, it glared at him with a primal fury and roared once again. Theo's heart raced, panic setting in. Meanwhile, back at training ground number 4, the tension was thick enough to cut with a sword. Sybil and the knights stood frozen. Hulkus, clearly pissed off, demanded an explanation from Ray. Where's Theo Ragnar? He needs to face me first. Ray, completely unbothered, shrugged him off. Losers should stay out of it, he said, which only made Hulkus' anger boil over. Hulkus fired back, his face flushed with frustration. 3 years have passed since our last duel, Ray. I've improved enough to close the gap. But Ray just shrugged, still calling him a loser, and that was all it took for Hulkus to snap. Red with rage, he lunged at her, roaring that they should settle it again, right here and now, to see who deserved to face Theon. His massive sword swung at her, but Ray, completely unbothered, blocked it without even breaking a sweat or moving a muscle. Sybil, looking totally confused by this sudden showdown, muttered, "What the hell is happening?" Henry, still nursing the punch Sybil had clocked him with earlier, whispered, "I don't know, but I'm terrified." Before the tension exploded any further, Remington appeared out of nowhere, slipping between Ray and Hulkus and using his sword to stop their clash cold. "If you two want to brawl, take it somewhere else," Remington warned, his voice low. "You're not causing trouble in Theo's domain while he's away." Hulkus, not fazed at all, greeted Remington with a cheerful grin, like they were old friends. "Remington, I've been wanting to duel you too." Remington's patience was wearing thin. "Did you not hear what I just said?" But before he could finish his thought, something dark, something powerful, hit them all like a ton of bricks. Everyone in the training ground felt it, a wave of overwhelming, suffocating force. Remington whipped around, trying to pinpoint the source of the killing intent. His eyes went wide when he realized it was coming from none other than Theo, slowly approaching, his presence heavier than ever. What happened to him during these 2 months? Remington thought, trying to make sense of the suffocating pressure Theo was radiating. Ray, meanwhile, just stood there watching quietly. Hulkus, on the other hand, grinned wide, almost thrilled at the sight of Theo. He was eager for this confrontation. Theo carried the power of the Lesser Drake now, a force that dominated the battlefield. Moments earlier, deep in the dungeon, the Drake had locked eyes with Theo, its anger flaring with one final roar. Theo had braced himself, expecting the beast to strike again, but instead, the Drake collapsed, dead. The system congratulated him for slaying the Lesser Drake as Theo pulled his sword from the reverse scale. He lay down on the Drake's body, exhausted, reflecting on just how close he'd come to losing. When the Drake had thrashed wildly after he hit its weak point, Theo was convinced it was over, but it had worn itself out. The system flashed his rewards: Lesser Drake's tooth and claw. He glanced at the descriptions. The tooth could be used to strengthen a weapon's durability, and the claw could enhance a weapon's sharpness. Theo looked at his worn-out sword, thinking it was time to give his mother's gift a little upgrade. Another notification popped up: he had gained the Lesser Drake's Fear skill, rank D with 1% mastery. It granted him the ability to release draconic killing intent, overwhelming weaker targets. Theo was stunned. Dragon killing intent wasn't something just anyone could get. It was a power for the elite. While he wasn't sure how useful it'd be in a place full of powerhouses like Ragnar, he knew this was a game changer. Storing the Drake's tooth, claw, and his sword in his inventory, Theo left the boss room. The system confirmed he'd cleared the Camellia Palace dungeon. As he stepped outside, a wave of relief washed over him. Quest complete. The system congratulated him once again, presenting his reward for clearing scenario quest number 1. A nest compass. Theo examined the strange item. The compass supposedly guided its holder to a nest, but he wasn't sure what that meant. Shrugging, he stashed it in his inventory for later. Right now, all he wanted was rest. Every step toward his room felt heavier than the last, exhaustion weighing him down. Suddenly, a maid came sprinting toward him, yelling something urgent. Theo groaned. "Can I not get a break?" But he turned to face her. The maid, wide-eyed and shocked at his bloody, disheveled state, stammered, "Where have you been?" Theo waved her off. "It's nothing. What's going on?" Panic crossed her face. "There's a brawl at training ground number 4. Theo sighed, frustration rising. Of course there is. When Theo arrived at the training ground, his irritation was obvious. Without hesitation, he activated his new fear skill, unleashing a wave of draconic killing intent. The weaker ones dropped like flies, collapsing under the weight of his power. Hulkus, on the other hand, beamed, clearly impressed. "Now we're talking," he laughed, charging at Theo with excitement, swinging his massive sword. Theo, completely unfazed, deflected Hulkus' attack with one swift upward swing, sending Hulkus flying back like he weighed nothing. The sheer power of Theo's counter left everyone, including Remington and Ray, in stunned silence. Hulkus, stumbling back to his feet, couldn't believe how easily his strike had been repelled. Still shaking off the impact, Hulkus growled, "No way am I taking that." He was furious now. Black Bear, as Hulkus Lank was often called, had always been considered one of the weaker of the four hounds of the North. He hadn't fully developed his skills and, frankly, wasn't the brightest bulb in the pack either. Hulkus roared as he swung his massive sword down at Theo, daring him to block it. Theo braced himself, fully aware that, as a member of the Lank clan, Hulkus had never been outmatched in sheer strength. But when the swords clashed, Theo deflected Hulkus' blade by slamming his own sword down, countering with his single flash technique and slicing Hulkus clean. A proud smirk crossed Theo's face as it hit him. He had just parried Hulkus' brute force and even managed to counter. Yeah, all that leveling up? Totally worth it. Hulkus coughed up blood, his body splattered with it, before he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Theo sighed, realizing he'd accidentally used his full strength in that swing, but felt relieved. Good thing it was Hulkus Lank, the human tank, Theo thought. That meant Hulkus had only fainted. Sybil stood there, mouth open, stunned. But then he started cheering, and soon the rest of Theo's followers joined in, chanting their young master's name. Theo defeated the Black Bear. He took down one of the four hounds with a single strike. The cheering didn't stop, even as Theo awkwardly tried to explain that Hulkus was still very much alive. Just then, Theo's sword cracked, and half of it fell to the ground. Panic hit him, his mother's birthday gift, destroyed. But before he could say anything, Sybil hollered in admiration. "Of course! Only you could break a sword with a single strike." Theo scowled. "Why are you so happy about this?" he snapped. Meanwhile, off in the distance, Remington and Ray watched in silence. Ray's gaze lingered on Theo, her mind flashing back to a childhood memory. She remembered a time when he had found her walking in the cold and asked, "Who are you? Why are you out here freezing?" He draped his scarf around her shoulders and asked if that helped, then commented, "You still look cold." Smiling warmly, he'd taken her hand and led her to his house, promising to keep her safe until the snow stopped. As Ray recalled that moment, a soft smile spread across her face. Then, without saying a word, she turned and walked away, leaving Remington speechless. Had Ray Ragnar just smiled? Back at the palace, Theo found himself in a bizarre situation. He sat there at the celebration, blushing under the weight of a ridiculous hat, as the maids excitedly congratulated him on his new title, Luster Tiger. They gushed about how hard he'd worked, telling him to keep it up until the awakening ceremony. His mother, Cecilia, appeared, proudly placing a giant bowl of food on the table. "My son," she beamed, as she began shoveling large portions onto his plate. "Try this. It's abalone." Theo tried to stop her, but she kept going, practically force-feeding him, insisting he try the meat from chickens raised only on acorns from the western Laxaria desert. He wanted to protest, but when he saw the look on her face, the sadness hit him like a wave. In his past life, he had seen her corpse. That memory crept in, making his voice softer as he told her the food was delicious. He smiled, appreciating her love, even if it came with an overabundance of food. Later, when the feast was over, Theo showed his mother the broken sword. Cecilia froze, stuttering as she took it from him. "What happened?" she asked, shocked. Theo, nervous and full from all that food, explained that the sword had broken during training. Apologetically, he added that it was the precious gift she'd given him for his birthday. To his surprise, Cecilia cursed loudly, something Theo wasn't expecting. "That old hag!" she shouted, making him look at her in confusion. She swore up and down that the sword, made from white snow steel and ebony steel wood, would never break. Theo blinked. "Wait, ebony steel wood? You mean the stuff from the Gaia jungle?" Cecilia nodded, her anger growing. "That's right. The old woman said it was made from only the rarest and most precious materials. But Theo knew ebony steel wood was no joke. It was a strange plant that fed on iron, giving it the flexibility of wood but the strength of steel. The sword was high quality, all right, but he hadn't realized it was that valuable. Now he wondered where his mother had even gotten such a rare sword. Cecilia, still fuming, declared, "This won't do. I'm confronting that old woman and demanding a replacement. She's gonna make a sword worthy of you or else." Theo, a bit overwhelmed, tried to calm her down. "Mom, it's fine. I'll just use another sword. But Cecilia wasn't having it. No way. People are starting to recognize your true worth, and we need to make sure everything is perfect, especially with the awakening ceremony just days away. I won't let you walk in there with a broken, shabby sword. Theo sighed, smiling at her determination. She was impossible to argue with. Now that we're on the subject, Cecilia continued, turning toward the door. Let's go right now. Theo grabbed the broken sword from the table and asked, Where are we going? She turned back, grinning confidently. To the best workshop in all of Wintora, the Basque Workshop. The Basque Workshop, one of the 3 biggest weapon manufacturing centers in Wintora, wasn't just massive like a factory. It had a reputation for producing the finest weapons. Theo couldn't help but feel a bit curious. The most jaw-dropping thing about the Basque Workshop wasn't its size, but its Master A legend in their world. Classified as special rank by the intelligence agency, this blacksmith held the elite title of Master Craftsman, a distinction shared by only 2 other artisans in the Ragnar family. But that's not all. This figure also carried some terrifying nicknames. The Elf of Capitalism Incarnate and the Demon Craftsman, Curson. Theo's mind was spinning. He was about to meet that Curson, a living legend. He couldn't wrap his head around how his mother knew the Demon Craftsman. But before he could ask, Cecilia casually asked Curson if she was still smoking and wait for it, called Curson her mother. Theo's brain almost short-circuited. His mother, the daughter of the Demon Craftsman? What? Curson wasn't having it. She shot back immediately, rejecting the mother title, reminding Cecilia that their relationship had ended the day she ran away. Theo was floored. He had always believed his mother was an orphan with no family ties. Now here he was learning that Curson, a freaking high elf, was his grandmother. A quarter elf. That explained a lot about his striking looks. Curson, turning to Cecilia, asked why their dear customer had shown up after never visiting before. Cecilia, without skipping a beat, tossed the broken sword toward Curson and said she was returning a defective product. Curson caught the sword, her irritation obvious. Defective? She growled, clearly offended. How dare Cecilia call one of her forged blades defective? But that irritation quickly turned to shock as Curson inspected the destroyed weapon. Cecilia, completely unbothered, pressed her. So, if it's not defective, then what is it? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Meanwhile, Theo stood off to the side, still grappling with the whole quarter elf bombshell. Curson, after a beat, asked who had wielded the sword. Cecilia, without hesitation, pointed to her son. Curson's eyes flicked to Theo, her expression sharp. Him? That boy behind you. Cecilia swiftly corrected her. Watch your words. That's no boy, that's Theo. A genius who will one day rule over Ragnar. Her voice was full of pride, and Theo felt a mix of embarrassment and determination under her glowing praise. Theo stepped forward, bowing respectfully. It's an honor to meet you, master of the Basque Workshop. I'm Theo. Curson, still fixated on the broken sword in her hands, nodded. I've heard of you, she muttered, her tone softer. Then, with a sideways glance at Cecilia, she added, You've raised him well. She gestured for them to follow her inside. As they walked deeper into the workshop, Theo turned to his mother, his curiosity getting the better of him. How do you know her? He asked. Is Curson really your mother? Cecilia shook her head, offering a small smile. No, not quite. Curson was my foster mother for about 6 months, she admitted. It was a long time ago, when I was just a girl she found interesting enough to take in for a short while. The revelation struck Theo like a bolt. So, Curson wasn't truly his grandmother, and that meant he wasn't part elf after all. It made sense, in a way. As if reading his thoughts, Cecilia added, She had a habit of collecting beautiful things, jewels, art, even people. She chuckled. Guess I was one of her prized acquisitions for a time. Curson's voice cut in abruptly, clearly not in the mood for nostalgia. Enough about that. The past is the past, and it's not relevant here, she said sharply, leading them down a narrow corridor. Cecilia teased, Come now, Curson, you don't really mean that. But Curson ignored the comment, marching ahead in stony silence. Theo's curiosity hadn't waned, though. So, why did you leave? He asked his mother. Curson answered for her, almost as if she was expecting the question. She left to become the Ragnar clan head's wife, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Imagine that, abandoning everything for a life of cold walls and stricter rules. Curson shook her head in disbelief but gave a small nod of respect. But to last this long there, that's something. Cecilia merely shrugged, her tone light. Well, the clan head did turn out to be quite the catch, she said playfully. Handsome, powerful, loved me dearly. Curson scoffed. Yet you came crawling back last year for a sword. Shameless, as always. Cecilia spun around, eyes blazing. Must you say such things in front of Theo? She demanded. Curson simply replied with a question of her own. Am I wrong? Theo watched the exchange with a newfound understanding. In his previous life, he had never really known his mother, let alone this connection to Curson. Perhaps he had been too blinded by his ambitions within the clan to see the person she truly was. Their destination arrived abruptly as Curson stopped before a sturdy, ornate door. This is my private forge, she announced, gesturing for Cecilia to stay outside. Theo, come in. As the door closed behind them, Curson's expression hardened, her eyes locking onto Theo. I won't waste time, she said. Do you possess a relic of the primordial dragon? Theo's brow furrowed. The primordial dragon? You mean the ancestor of the guardian dragon who founded Ragnar? He recounted the old legend about how their forebear had scattered the dragon's relics across Wintora, leaving clues for their descendants. Curson's grip tightened on the broken sword. Don't play coy with me, boy, she snapped. This sword didn't shatter from a mere fight. It faced something far beyond normal. Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and grief. I poured everything into making this. It shouldn't have broken, unless it clashed with a relic of the primordial dragon. Theo blinked, startled. He had fought the lesser drake, and yes, the sword had cracked, but a relic? I don't know what you mean, he replied truthfully. Curson turned away, muttering, Forget it. It's faster to show you. She reached into a nearby chest and pulled out a heavy object wrapped in chains. What do you see here? She asked, her voice low. Theo's eyes widened as he recognized the faint blue glow radiating from the object. It was the same hue he had seen when he first encountered the dungeon in Camellia Palace. It's glowing, he murmured. Curson gave a sharp nod. I thought so. I can't see it, but you can. This is the relic I spoke of, sealed inside this case. I've tried countless times to unlock it, but nothing's worked. She placed the object on the ground between them. This, Theo, is the white moonlight blade, forged from the fang of the primordial dragon during the Age of Myths. Theo's heart pounded in his chest. The white moonlight blade, he had heard of it only in whispers. Even the most ancient texts spoke of it as if it were a mere myth. If you can break the seal and draw the blade, it's yours, Curson said, but her tone was grim. But know this, it could kill you. Theo swallowed, then nodded. I'll take that chance. The system flickered into view before his eyes, displaying a new quest. Scenario quest number 2, the path of the successor. His mission was clear, claim the white moonlight blade. Theo reached into his inventory and retrieved the blue key, the very one he had used to unlock the dungeon at Camellia Palace. Curson's eyes widened as she recognized the key. Theo fit the key into the lock, and with a twist, the chains loosened and fell away. Dark energy spilled out, enveloping him like a storm. The next moment, Theo found himself in a different place, a ruined version of Rose Palace. The air was heavy with despair, the scene eerily familiar. What's going on? He wondered aloud. Suddenly, a massive eagle emerged, swooping down toward him. But Theo moved faster, grabbing its beak and halting its attack. The illusion shattered as quickly as it had appeared. So, you thought you could trick me with this pathetic illusion? Theo sneered at the eagle. The bird's eyes widened, realizing it had failed. How? How did you resist? It demanded. Theo smirked. I've already conquered the despair you tried to use against me, he said. That trick won't work. The eagle began to shrink, its grand form reducing to a mere shadow of its previous size. Theo gripped its beak tighter. You're weaker than you used to be, aren't you? Must be the seal, he said, swinging his fist. Outside the room, Cecilia was frantic, calling out to Theo and demanding answers from Curson. "What is happening to my son?" she shouted. Kirsten's eyes remained fixed on Theo. She could see the dark energy entwining with his aura, something she hadn't anticipated. She had thought the boy's connection to the relic would protect him. But now, "Stop this!" Cecilia cried, her voice breaking. Suddenly, the dark energy surged and then vanished, sucked into Theo's body. His eyes snapped open, glowing with newfound power. "Mother," he said, turning towards Cecilia's tearful face. "I'm all right." The system chimed in, announcing the completion of scenario quest number 2 and the acquisition of the white moonlight blade. Theo felt the pulse of the sword's magic coursing through him, strengthening his very soul. He had emerged victorious, and with the relic's power now flowing through his veins, the path to his destiny had become clearer than ever. His magic power surged, rising by 30 points and pushing his total past 200. This increase triggered an unexpected transformation. His magic power gained divinity, a special trait that enhanced his physical abilities and granted a 1.5-second magic power recovery boost. While pleased to wield magic power rivaling that of a high-ranking swordsman, Theo knew he'd have to bide his time until the awakening ceremony to truly unleash his strength. For now, restraint was his ally. Kirsten, clearly taken aback, congratulated him for succeeding in claiming the relic, though Cecilia's glare kept her on edge. Theo turned to Kirsten, asking if she would keep her promise. With a sly smile, Kirsten replied, "Elves cannot lie. Didn't you know?" At that moment, Theo felt the sword tremble, and Kirsten commented on its defiant nature. "Does that mean it hasn't accepted me as its master?" Theo wondered aloud, noticing how the sword seemed to quiver in fear under his gaze. Kirsten clarified, "Not exactly. It's more like the sword's been caged for centuries, and now it wants to stretch its wings." She pointed to a reinforced slashing board. "Why don't you take a swing at that?" Theo hesitated, but Kirsten confidently assured him, "Even if it's the white moonlight sword, a single swing from someone who hasn't awakened won't damage my workshop." Her casual tone irked him, but he saw the opportunity to test the sword's power, especially since he could suppress the dragon heart's aura at will. Theo unwrapped the blade and approached the slashing board, a small smile playing on his lips as he prepared to strike. He channeled some magic power into the sword. The system notified him that the white moonlight sword was not only a monster sword inhabited by a griffin, but also a relic of the primordial dragon. Drawing the blade back, he gathered his strength, and a fierce wind swept through the room. Alarmed, Kirsten tried to intervene, but it was too late. Theo's sword flashed in a swift arc, slicing through the air with such force that it cut the workshop in half. Cecilia's eyes widened, and Kirsten stood rooted to the spot, speechless. Then, panic flashed across Kirsten's face as she surveyed the devastation. The realization hitting her like a blow, her workshop, her beloved workshop, had been obliterated. Theo, stunned by the damage, understood that the sword had absorbed far more magic power than he had anticipated. Before he could react, Kirsten appeared beside him with startling speed. Her gaze was sharp as she studied him. "No mana hull. That's unexpected," she murmured, reaching the conclusion that Theo's sheer natural strength had made the sword so devastating. She looked at him with something like awe. "You're a genius, my boy," she declared, her pride spilling over. "From now on, I'm your patron. We'll show the world your talent." For Kirsten, Theo was the perfect walking advertisement for the Basque workshop's legendary craftsmanship. Her excitement was palpable, and Theo, caught off guard, didn't quite know how to respond. Cecilia, noticing Kirsten's money-minded enthusiasm, gave a dry comment that brought the elf back to reality. After they said their farewells, Theo handed Kirsten 2 large teeth taken from the lesser drake for the workshop's repairs. Kirsten, recognizing the loot, was impressed by what Theo had achieved to obtain the relic. As she entered the remnants of her workshop, she heard a familiar voice behind her and turned to see a crow perched nearby. She frowned, demanding to know what the bird wanted, but it only stared at her in silence. 5 days later, the day of the awakening ceremony arrived. Theo was at the training grounds sparring with Evelyn. His growth over the past months had been immense. He was no longer just holding his own, he was pushing her back. Evelyn acknowledged his progress, noting how his strikes had grown faster and stronger. "Your swordplay has become impressive," she admitted, her eyes gleaming with approval. Theo responded with a relieved grin, grateful for her praise. His followers, who were watching, whispered among themselves about how far he had come. Evelyn reflected on how much he had changed, capable of matching her blow for blow. Deciding to test him further, she increased her intensity, swinging with full strength. Theo met her blade head-on, easily deflecting the blow. Her smile widened. He might just make valedictorian at the ceremony, she thought to herself. Theo, catching his breath, expressed his thanks, saying, "If I do make it as valedictorian, I'll be sure to mention you in my speech." Evelyn's face flushed slightly, caught off guard by his promise, while his followers eagerly clamored for a shout-out too. All right, Theo chuckled, amused at the attention. "We'll see how it goes." He announced his departure, and with that, he made his way to the central headquarters for the ceremony. Entering the ceremony room, he introduced himself to the guards as Theo Ragnar of Camellia Palace. This day marked a pivotal moment for the clan, a chance for the next generation of Ragnar swordsmen to prove themselves. Every member of the family was in attendance, including the esteemed clan head, Kyle Ragnar, and the 9 dragons. Even Hilda Ragnar, the revered former clan head, was present. Despite her age, she appeared remarkably youthful, which reassured Theo. As a drumbeat reverberated through the room, the participants' attention snapped to the front. Vahana Ragnar, the judge, and Dragon Gate swordsman stood before them. He explained the rules. Each participant would grab a sword, channel their magic power, and leave a mark on a steel wall composed of white snow steel, a nearly indestructible material. Only those who could channel magic into their strikes would succeed. To aid the participants, Vahana distributed Soma, a pill that granted a temporary boost of 10 annuals of magic power to help them open their mana hulls. The depth of the cut would determine each participant's standing. After setting the expectations, Vahana called out the first name. "Theo Ragnar," he announced. Theo stepped forward, taking a deep breath. He recalled that, in his previous life, action had emerged as valedictorian. But this time, things would be different. He wasn't here to play the same old game. He was here to rewrite the script altogether. Theo took a deep breath as he approached the knight stationed beside the stage. He grabbed the Soma, pulled a standard sword from the ground, and advanced toward the white snow steel wall, determination radiating from him. This time, there was no chance action would walk away with the title of valedictorian. As if on cue, the system interface flickered to life, displaying scenario quest number 3, the victor of the awakening ceremony. His mission was clear: he had to become the valedictorian. Elsewhere, Hilda Ragnar glanced at Kyle. "Is that the boy you mentioned?" she asked, a glint of curiosity in her eyes. Kyle nodded. "Yes, he's caught my attention." Hilda's intrigue deepened. "Well, this should be interesting. Let's see if the boy lives up to the hype." Theo's shoulders relaxed as he reached the wall, though a trace of nervousness lingered. He couldn't help but remember his past life's failure when the Soma had wreaked havoc on his mana flow, leaving him severely injured. But this time, he had both a dragon heart and a mana haul. There would be no mistakes. At Vahana's command, Theo swallowed the Soma. A surge of mana exploded from within him, and even Vahana was taken aback by the sheer volume. Mana waves rippled outward as Theo stood, seemingly calm, but the intensity of his aura was undeniable. Vahana braced himself, expecting Theo to lose control any second, just as any unseasoned warrior might. Yet, the mana settled, smoothly flowing through Theo's body. The astonishment on Vahana's face said it all. This was no ordinary swordsman. With the Soma's power coursing through him, Theo gripped the sword and took aim. Channeling his mana into the blade, he swung it backward, the force of his magic generating a faint shimmer around the steel. In a flash, he lunged forward, unleashing the single slash technique. Mana surged from the blade in a dragon-shaped arc that collided with the wall, leaving a deep, jagged mark visible from the farthest corners of the arena. Remington, Ray, and Hulkus were stunned. The sheer force behind Theo's attack had been incredible. As for Action, he seethed with fury, eyes glued to the impressive cut left behind. Vahana, struggling to maintain his composure, announced that Theo Ragnar had passed. Murmurs spread through the audience like wildfire. Comparisons were already being drawn to legendary figures like Thorkel. Had they really just witnessed a first-time mana user perform such a feat? The system chimed in again, notifying Theo that his luck stat had finally climbed out of the negative, lifting the curse of misfortune that had plagued him for so long. With it came the promise that his fame would start to spread across the world. For the first time in a while, he felt truly free, standing at the same starting line as the other promising swordsmen. Names of the clan's elites flashed on the interface. Ozer Ragnar Plunis wanted him as a disciple, Julius Ragnar was annoyed by the attention Theo garnered, Robber Ragnar remained wary, and Hilda's interest grew stronger. It was all well and good, but Theo's focus zeroed in on one thing, catching Hilda's eye. If he could win her favor and acquire the heart of Garuda, he'd become stronger than anyone here. After Theo left the stage, Sybil took his turn, managing to make a small scratch on the wall, just enough to pass. He hurried over to Theo, beaming with pride at his success. Hulkus, Remington, and Ray also passed, their marks deeper than Sybil's but none matching Theo's impressive cut. The crowd buzzed, recognizing the rivalry that had taken shape between the Luster Tiger Theo and the Dark Tiger Action. Action stormed to the stage, his face twisted in defiance. He downed the soma in one gulp, ignoring Vahana's warnings. Without hesitation, he swung his sword, unleashing a dragon force that carved deep into the wall. Vahana, stunned for the umpteenth time that day, watched as Action's slash nearly matched Theo's. Whispers rippled through the crowd, debates igniting over who had come out on top. Action heard them all, and his jaw clenched tighter with every word. Without waiting for confirmation, he marched off the stage. Once the dust settled, Vahana announced the end of the first stage and praised the participants for their exceptional performances. He reminded them that the second stage was just 4 days away and that they needed to prepare. Finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The rankings were about to be revealed. He took a breath before declaring, "And now, the valedictorian of the first stage of the awakening ceremony." But before the results are announced, the scene cuts out, leaving everyone on the edge of their seats. If you want to know what happens next, you know the drill. Smash that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you don't want to miss the next part.